This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning. Good morning, good morning. I feel like a nice loud bang to the gavel is exactly what everyone wants at 10 a.m. Welcome to the guests in the chamber, those in the public gallery, and to my committee members, and to those joining us online. Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Now, members of the public might like to follow us on Twitter at the London Assembly, so that's at London Assembly on Twitter, and we use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. I think each committee meeting I promise to come up with a better hashtag and do not deliver, so hold tight folks, it is on its way. I'd like to give a warm welcome to the pupils of Year 6 Britannia Village Primary School in Newham who are not here yet, but my script has told me to welcome them, so I welcome them. In anticipation for their arrival, hopefully they'll be coming and watching for a little while, which will be lovely, because I think particularly this topic that I'll come on to talk about in a moment is probably quite an accessible aspect of planning, so hopefully they will enjoy hearing from us. Please, may I remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. And it's probably worth at this point just reminding, because it does take a little bit getting used to, obviously just switch on and off every time you go on to speak, and just ensure that the microphone is a little bit bent in towards you. Members and guests are also reminded to position their microphones. Great, the script is ahead of me. If you, I'll skip that. So today we are holding an investigation on the architectural design of post-war social housing in London and the impact that it has had on Londoners. Before I begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assemblymember Fortune and Assemblymember Best, for whom Assemblymember Garrett is attending as a substitute.
Great, thank you, Jack, and welcome Assemblymember Garrett to the Planning and Regeneration Committee. We appreciate you substituting for one of your committee members. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? That's your cue, members.
No.
Great. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 7th of June 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Great. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meetings? And can we note the action taken by me, the chair of the committee, under delegated authority, following consultation with party group lead members, to agree the committee's response to the consultation on the GLA London Plan Guidance on Affordable Housing and Development Viability? Great, thank you. Can we note the response received from the Mayor to the committee's letter on the future of planning in London? Grand. Now we can move on to the main item business, a discussion on the architectural design of post-war social housing in London and its impact on Londoners. I have to say I'm really excited for this discussion. A big credit to Scrutiny and the work that they've done in pulling together a really excellent briefing that archives and celebrates some of the fantastic design that we have across London in our social housing estates. And really looking forward to hearing from the sort of rich expertise of the panel. I feel like we've got a bit of a stellar lineup of guests, so we're really grateful for your time, and we are awaiting one final guest who'll join us in a moment, but I'll give by way a quick introduction before we pass over to you with the questions. We are expecting shortly Kate Macintosh MBE, architect who's best known for designing Dawson's Heights in Southwark, but we have here with us already John Boughton, author of Municipal Dreams, The Rise and Fall of Council Housing, and I'm not sure if James Potts in the audience has brought his book to get it signed, but I'm yet to read it, but I've been told very good things, John, so I'm sure there'll be some book signing afterwards. Charleen Henry recently joined the GLA, senior urban designer. Welcome. Christine Wagg, historian, Peabody Trust. Thank you, Christine. I know that you met with the committee last week as well for site visits, so it was great to have you again. And Alice Brownfield, architect and director from Peter Barber Architects. Welcome, Alice. We've had apologies from one guest who was due to join us, Federico, or it's head of content and New London Architecture. But other than that, we are a full house. So yeah, welcome, and thank you again in advance for your expertise. So I'll crack on with the questions. I'll begin with John, if that's all right. And I wanted to ask you, what were the social conditions that promoted the development of social housing in London?
I've just read. I assume I've worked that correctly by pressing the red button. Is that?
That was perfect.
Thank you. Okay. What were the social conditions? Sorry, could you repeat the question just so I can?
Of course. In your opinion, what were the social conditions that promoted the development of social housing in London originally?
Originally, or, well, I mean, do you want to go back to the foundations of social housing in the 1890s or post-war
that's
specifically?
exactly what we want to do.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean...
Get old school on us.
I mean, desperate need, essentially. Obviously, appalling conditions, appalling housing conditions for the working class people of London. Need in itself is really a dynamic for sort of political action, certainly so far, you know, in a less than democratic state as it was in that time. So a lot of middle class fear about health and disease, ill health, disease, alleged criminality and immorality. So the sense was, and of course Peabody was a manifestation of this too, that sort of 5% philanthropy of the 19th century. The sense was that housing, better housing, was needed to promote health and fitness for working class people, alongside pressure from below, of course, a rising trade union and labour movement pressing for better working class conditions. So in brief, necessity with accompanying political dynamics.
Thank you very much. And I just actually want to expand on that a little bit more. Do you think, I know that there was a quote in your book actually around the kind of, like you said, the balance between this idea of purity or morality versus need. So could you just talk a little bit more about, you think, the values that drove the origins of social housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly the humanitarian concern. There was belief that British citizens should not be living in this appalling conditions. You get various manifestations of this in the kind of political literature, polemical literature of the day. You get specifically that is accompanied by, for the first time, an emerging social science, sociology literature, Charles Booth poverty map, which revealed up to a third of Londoners were living under the poverty line. And he described the worst conditions of vicious semi-criminal. So even in his statistical rigour, he kind of lapsed into that kind of paternalistic Victorian fear of working class lifestyles promoted by bad housing, allegedly promoted by bad housing. So there was humanitarianism, there was middle class self-interest, and as I say before, in an emergent democracy, working class men got the vote from 67, 84, formed a majority. In that emergent democracy, there's also obviously a political imperative that the upper class politicians respond to that pressure from below.
Okay, thank you. Because I think one thing that became apparent to me as I was sort of doing the sort of reading the briefing and the sort of research for this is I'm intrigued by the relationship between values and how that impacts on design. So I'll sort of segue into my second question to you, John, which is, what do you think influenced the design of social housing estates in the post-war period? In the post-war period, and in London specifically, yes. You're talking about. Well, I think planning was the thing that emerges in the Second World War, and really kind of determines the shape of what follows. So there were key planning ideas, which were seen at the time as a corrective to the kind of errors and missteps of large-scale council house building in the interwar period. In the interwar period, you have these huge estates, or depending on where you are, of course, these huge estates like Becontree, 24,000 homes in Becontree, overwhelmingly, in fact entirely, 2-3 bedroom family homes. So one with what was felt to be a kind of corresponding lack of facilities and infrastructure to support that very large scale community, 126,000 people. So first of all, planning ideas emerge as a corrective to those missteps, and they include, firstly, a notion of mixed development, that a variety of housing forms to suit a range of people with different housing needs. So rather than just families, in conventional terms, mum and dad and kids, single people, couples, elderly people in particular, of course. So mixed development, which of course architecture also allowed more interesting range and form of a range of housing forms. So it was embraced both by planners in a sense, but also by architects who had the opportunity to build more interestingly.
with greater point and contrast, to use Gibbert's phrase, Frederick Gibbert. So mixed development was one key idea. Another one was the sense of mixed community, and the idea that emerges with the Labour government, of course, and Nye Bevan in particular, was that council housing should serve a range of the population, a cross section of the population. So up to 45, up to 49, technically, 1949, council housing had been designated working class housing for the labouring classes, artisanal classes, whatever the phrasing was of the day. So for Labour at least, and this was not a cross-party notion, but for Labour, Labour saw it as serving general needs across sections of the population. Bevan famously talked about the living tapestry of a mixed community. So that was the key idea. Now, in terms of the kind of overall planning, of course, the notion in London was firstly what they called decongestion. The sense was that London was overpopulated, that its inner city areas were certainly congested, in the language of the day, and that London needed to lose a couple of 100,000 of its population. And in that context, of course, you get the out-of-county estates emerging. Some of these are developed in the interwar period, but expanded in the post-war period. So these out-of-county estates around the fringes of the capital, the London County Council, then, of course. And, of course, new towns, a ring of 8 new towns around London. So this was the sort of overarching planning ideal. And in that context, of course, whilst in overall terms you're looking at reducing the population of London, reducing that density, it is taken for granted and understood that in inner city London and the sort of zone around the immediate inner city, you require a certain amount of housing density. So in that context, that is the context in which multi-storey housing emerges, in that perceived necessity for a denser population within inner London. So there's no great shift towards, there's no sort of avowed shift towards high-rise in the immediate post-war period, but the planning ideal that emerges definitely calls for multi-storey accommodation in inner London.
Okay, thank you, John. That was fascinating. I think my next question has sort of actually been answered, but do elaborate if you do want to add to it. Otherwise, I'll move on to my next question, which was, what were the underlying principles behind government decisions on new developments at the time? But I do think you've answered that, unless you wanted to add anything.
No, I mean, I think I probably, pretty much said it. I mean, in the immediate post-war period, Nye Bevan is pledged to high-quality council housing. He in his vision, as I say, is one of council housing serving a mixed community, and he's definitely committed to high-quality housing, both in terms of space standards, 2 inside toilets for a 3-bedroom home, and unprecedented luxury for working-class people. So this real desire to build to a very high standard. That shifts somewhat with the succeeding Conservative government. Actually, the highest number of council houses built in a single year, 219,000 were built in 1953, built essentially by Harold Macmillan under a Conservative government. But there's a slight shift in space standards, a slight reduction of quality, but nothing that I would actually exaggerate too much. So I think overwhelmingly there is a commitment in the post-war period to good quality housing, which will be attractive to a mixed population.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to move on to my next question, which I'm going to open up to the rest of the panel. It kind of begins to overlap with some of the questions that Assemblymember Garrett is going to talk about, which is obviously what we're really interested in, lessons that we can learn from previous design of social housing, and again, where the values underpinned the way that we designed and what that means in terms of whether there's been a value shift or if it's to do with costing or sustainability. But to that end, one of the things that committee was looking at is older estate design, so such as cottage estates. why do we think they fell out of favour in terms of design and the trends of how we would, design our social housing? Was there an inherent flaw in the original designs, or were there external factors responsible for their loss of popularity? So I'm going to open that out to the committee, and especially the guests who haven't had a chance yet to begin their introductory remarks. Feel free to add anything beyond what's in the question. Who would like to go?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, okay. Well, I think the problem so what emerges in the 1950s, of course, is a fear of urban sprawl. So if we're talking about, large-scale so-called cottage estates, these which were these kind of peripheral estates, as Watling Estate and so on, there's a whole ring of them which you'll be familiar with in London. There was a fear that this was basically eating into what was now designated greenbelt land. So that combination of fear of urban sprawl with, in fact, imposition of greenbelt policies impedes the development of large-scale cottage estates. I mean, and that's where you get, obviously, this greater focus on multi-storey inner city development, all for good and highly plausible reasons. Cottage, I don't think, for me, there's no inherent flaw whatsoever in terms of cottage estates. They're still generally held up as being a kind of a rather an acme, of good design. There were criticisms in the 1930s, as I kind of alluded to, the lack of facilities and so on. And for a while, they were seen as kind of essentially kind of dormitories, and people were commuting elsewhere and so on. So there was this kind of criticism which emerged in the 1930s. But these are communities, these are estates. There's always the tendency with council housing is to take a snapshot, snapshot, and say, well, this is wrong. And of course, over time, take the Watling estate, which was criticised very heavily in the 1930s, and in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you look at the kind of oral history, you look at the personal experience and the memoirs, and so on, and it's a rich, vibrant community. It's a settled community. So cottage estates, I think, are proved successful overall, but of course the main reason we don't build them now is because of the cost of land and the lack of political will and financial support to do so. We between 1945 and 1979 we built 126,000 council houses a year on average. We're building, in terms of council houses itself, 6,000 to 7,000 currently. So we have an enormous kind of deficit, a lack of will, a lack of ambition, and that has created the housing crisis that we exist in. And I would absolutely emphasise that point. I haven't seen your background briefing, but in terms of the briefings I've seen, I want to make it absolutely clear that for me, council housing hasn't failed. It didn't fail, and I reject a kind of a thesis which frames council housing in terms of failure and in terms of design, because in fact council housing overwhelmingly succeeded in providing a good home for many millions of our people over time. Sorry to make that point, but I think it's important for me to get across.
I don't think you need to apologise for making that point, John. Thank you very much. Christine, Charleen or Alice, did you want to add anything to these questions or make any remarks before I pass over to other committee members?
I'd like perhaps to say something about the situation a little before what John said in his opening remarks, because of course council housing didn't really start until legislation was brought in. Late 19th and early 20th century was when you get the first council housing, but philanthropic housing provided by organisations like Peabody actually started, the first attempts were in the 1840s. It wasn't really until 1862 when George Peabody founded Peabody Trust that this type of development became possible on a larger scale. One of the difficulties that London had, I think, was that it was growing at a tremendous rate. The population exploded because people were moving in from the countryside into London. It grew tremendously. There was a great deal of slum housing, which was overpriced and very unhealthy. And then the growth of the railways meant that there was a large amount of land had to be cleared for building railway termini, and that meant more people were having to be turned out of their homes. So at that time, London didn't have a government body covering the whole of London. It had only got the Metropolitan Board of Works, which had got very limited powers. Most powers were vested in the individual boroughs, which of course were much smaller than the ones we have today. And that was why the provision of affordable housing for working people was not really regarded as the responsibility of the public authorities. Very much a Victorian attitude. I mean, like schooling, for example. It wasn't until you get legislation in 1870 that you get much greater provision of elementary schooling. So it was, to some extent, the growth of London and the lack of a central authority that made organisations like Peabody and others that worked in the same way, like Guinness, Sutton and Samuel Lewis, so important to provide affordable housing on a large scale before council housing came in. And then going on to the point about cottage estates, Peabody's early estates in the first 40 years were all blocks of flats. Initially, they aimed to build only up to 4 stories in height. In the 1880s, Peabody worked in conjunction with the Metropolitan Board of Works in London's first slum clearance schemes, when the board was given compulsory purchase powers, which were completely new. And because so many slum dwellers needed to be rehoused, the Peabody trustees were forced against their will to build up to 6 stories in height, which they really only liked 4 or at maximum 5 stories. We didn't build cottage estates until the early 20th century. There are 2 in the first 10 years of the 20th century, the Tottenham estate, which is all cottages, and the Rosendale Road estate at Kernhill, which is a mixture of blocks of flats and cottages. But initially we'd only been working within an 8-mile radius of the Royal Exchange in the City of London, so the density of building was a consequence of that. It was only after 1900, when we received a Royal Charter, that widened our area of operations to 12 miles from the Royal Exchange, that it became possible to buy sites further out which were larger, lent themselves more to building of cottage estates, and of course improved public transport meant that people could start commuting to work, whereas the inner city estates, most people walk to their jobs, and you can tell from the occupations that the employers were based very near where the people were living.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for that context, Christine. Charleen or Alice, is there anything that you'd like to add before we move on? No, Charleen, fantastic. And Alice?
I feel like John and Christine have already spoken so eloquently and knowledgeably about cottage estates, and I guess my knowledge comes in more to sort of, like, I guess sort of what we can learn from the 60s and 70s. I just wanted to, so I won't go on to that because it might come up later, but I wanted just to add that when we're looking at sort of what we can learn from design, and obviously John's talked about sort of a slightly lower density of sort of cottage estates, but when we also look at other types like cottage flats, like the Warner flats in Walthamstow, that are really quite popular housing now, there are huge benefits from that socially, in terms of sort of everyone having an own front door onto a street, and that creating a sort of opportunity for people to mix more prominently in public space. And I just wanted to add that in too, because I think that's an important, there are typologies within those which are really useful for us to learn from today.
Thank you, Alice. We will definitely be going on to talk about those kind of topologies and communal space, and I'll be passing over to Assemblymember Garrett now, who's going to drill down a little bit more into design. But before that, I just wanted to welcome Kate and say thank you for joining us, Kate. Great to have you. Hope you're feeling settled in, and then we'll probably start firing some questions at you. And if I understand, is it someone else has indicated briefly? Oh no, Charleen said she didn't want to. Oh, you do? Okay, coming back in. Great, I love it.
Just you did just mention about the typologies, and my experience is mostly...
Charleen, can I just get you to bring your mic a little, like, if you just pull it down as well? Perfect, thank you.
I know we're going to be moving on to typologies later, but just sort of clarifying that in my experience in post-war estates, that the use of different typologies, etc., really does enrich an estate, and I think that's one of the benefits in terms of regeneration, in terms of high density estates, and providing that range, different communities and different residents is a really positive thing. And one of the case studies that I can think of is Oval Quarter in Brixton. That does provide that sort of range of different tenures and typologies.
Thank you, Charleen. Just because you've sort of got me intrigued now, can you elaborate a little bit more about what range of typologies you felt were a good introduction in terms of the mix of design?
In terms of typologies, I think it's, I mean, even in the sort of GLA optimization, there are different typologies in terms of high-rise, in terms of medium-sized blocks, like deck access, maisonettes, and it just gives a range of offerings to people, and I think that should be commended, and it's something that is always encouraged, I think.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Kate, just whilst you finish settling in, I'll pass over to Assemblymember Garrett, and I'm sure you'll be able to catch up and let us know any introductory thoughts that you want when questions are put to you. Assemblymember Garrett.
Thanks. Yeah, oh, excuse me. Yeah, I'm interested in this question about the built environment that we create. I think it was Churchill who said, you know, we shape our cities and then they shape us. And so the kind of built environment that you create and that people then end up growing up in, I think is quite important, or living in. And particularly, you know, the multiple different generations of thoughts about the kinds of buildings that you build as social housing, and just listening to the conversation there. So in Sutton, we have Sutton Garden Suburb, which has several of those little cottage estates, which is what I've this week discovered those things are called in All-Tone Way, and they're very popular, very, very lovely places to live. And actually, Christine, you're talking about pre-council housing. Croydon has a sort of landmark of almshouses right in the town centre. It's quite interesting to see how something that was built a very long time ago continues to shape the environment that we have and the environment that we live in. And I suppose that's my question really, is what are the lessons from those previous styles, from, you know, the cottage estates, and then something very different like, I don't know, Trellick Tower, or those sorts of very tall concrete tower blocks, which often excite quite strong opinion. We're in a position now where there's a great deal of housing that needs to be built, and I think, what will the built environment be like 50, 100 years from now that we're building in the near future that is going to shape all of those people's lives? So if I perhaps I'll start with you, Christine. What are the lessons that you think we should be applying today when we think particularly about building social housing, in terms of the kinds of environment that we ought to be building, or the lessons that we learned from what we built in the past, either positive or negative?
Sorry, if you're directing that question.
I was, yes, my apologies. Yes.
Yes, sorry. Being Peabody's historian, my area of expertise is our early history. I'm not really qualified to talk about design criteria and things that we focus on today. I have brought some publications with me that cover our recent work and our plans and aspirations much better than I could possibly say, so I'm happy to leave those with you, but I don't really think it was appropriate for me to try to answer questions on areas outside my expertise.
In fact, one of those recent projects, of course, is BedZ, also my constituency.
Yes, indeed, yes. Yes, I have been to BedZ.
Charleen, I don't know whether you had thoughts, or you sort of starting to talk a bit just now about typologies, about, you know, what lessons we take from what's been done in the past, good or bad?
Certainly. So I've been involved in quite a few post-war estates and in South London, and overwhelmingly some of the issues that were created by design typically sort of surrounded, sort of centred on layout of estates, and that sort of determined how successful they possibly could be. And it's sort of like the movement away from the traditional street pattern, perhaps in terms of creating the sort of labyrinth of routes. I mentioned Oval Quarter before. The existing estate didn't have any sort of legible routes through the estate, disconnected street patterns, entrances weren't clearly visible, they were at high level, there's sort of circuitous routes around the estate, and that caused a host of problems, not only just for residents, but in terms of facilitating criminality, but in terms of the impact that it had on crime and antisocial behaviour, and that sort of exasperated over the years. So some of the lessons learned are now indeed embedded in sort of the London plan in their design policies. It's about clear, legible routes. It's about front doors on streets. It's about community spaces, communal areas, a clear definition between public and private spaces. In terms of internal layout, that's about limiting the number of homes perhaps accessed from a core, so that you know your neighbours, and that perhaps you can challenge anybody that you don't know that is in that space. So there are a lot of sort of lessons that we can learn. That's not to say that all post-war estates have failed because they don't follow exactly the same traditional street pattern. I mean, there are really good examples like Cressingham Gardens, but they sort of follow the same principles in terms of street people, that sense of neighbourliness as well that can be fostered in a post-war estate. I think really successful. So there are a few lessons that we definitely can learn from that.
Thanks, Charleen. John, I think you maybe touched a bit on this earlier, but just to specifically good. I mean, not just bad lessons. I realise it feels like an underarm toss of, let's say, everything that was horrible that happened in the past, but there were some good things. So, what are the things that we need to hold on to and maybe to let slide by?
Well, I'm going to be the maybe an awkward person here, and I'll probably actually diverge quite significantly from the perspective that Charleen was offering, respectfully. So, firstly, this will sound arrogant, but I think firstly I've looked at a lot of estates across the country in all shapes and forms, and I probably, I know a lot of council housing. Secondly, I'm an historian, and I think that's actually a pretty useful perspective, because as I kind of alluded to earlier, we're very kind of prone to taking a snapshot and saying, well, this estate is failing. Well, I've looked at those estates, and those estates that were failing were frequently, normally, very successful at other times. So what changes? The architecture doesn't change, the planning doesn't change. They're the same estates. What's made the difference is the conditions in which those people are living in terms of the social and economic circumstances of that population, that community. The most important thing that happened to council housing, council housing communities, was not this or that bit of architecture, but what happened to their living standards and life possibilities. And of course, council housing throughout, through into the 50s, into the 60s.
Apologies to interrupt. When you say living standards, are you talking about sort of income, cost of living, that kind of living standard? You're not talking about, the built environment, how many toilets you have?
Yeah, I'm talking about income and cost of living. I'm talking about employment, unemployment, mass unemployment emerging in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm talking about I'm going to have to use this horrible bit of jargon now, the residualisation of the council housing population. So council, as I was saying, council housing was overwhelmingly aspirational housing. It was a step up for millions for all its tenants, all its residents, for most of its lifetime. But council housing comes from the 70s into the 80s, 90s and so on to house an increasingly poor and disadvantaged population. Estates, let's take the Pepys estate, for example, the Pepys estate in Lewisham. The Pepys estate that has streets in the sky, has these walkways, had walkways and deck access and so on. These are all things which became very bad, apparently, in later decades. They promote criminality and antisocial behaviour and so on. Well, they didn't in the 1960s. They were conduits of neighbourliness, sociability. Elderly women walking to the shops, taking hours to get there because they were chatting with their neighbours. My friend Fiona lived in Aragon Tower, which has now been sold off to the private sector. It was a horrible council house. Horrible council tower block, but very attractive to Barrett's, who bought it and then added some penthouse suites. And now it's a middle class des res. But Fiona remembers it, and this is completely against the kind of conventional wisdom and sort of grain of commentary. She remembers her tower block, her corridor as being, an immensely sociable place, people leaving their doors open, popping in to look after the kids and so on and so on. I mean, I'm not claiming that's all the one truth or against that truth, but I'm saying I fundamentally reject the notion, the kind of architectural determinist notion that that design inexorably shapes people's experience. I think it's I'm all for good design. I'm immensely grateful for people like Kate and other public sector architects. 49% of qualified architects worked in the public sector into the 1970s. So we had that expertise, we had that idealism and that commitment in that period, which unfortunately we've lost now to a large extent. So I'm immensely grateful for good design and thoughtful care and attention paid to planning and community space and all those things. I'm certainly not advocating kind of a careless attitude towards us, but and I'll stop shortly. But just to kind of make the point, I am very sceptical, and in essence, of the kind of argument that certain forms of modernist design were inherently problematic. So I know Alice Coleman's kind of defensible space thesis became incredibly popular. I think it's been questioned by some, by many people, methodologically at least. It's very, very flawed in terms of its analysis. It's highly suspect. I mean, if you look, sorry, I will stop shortly. But in the 80s, people looked at the kind of let's take the worst case scenario, rioting. There was a lot of real kind of social discontent, youth anger expressed against the police and shown in rioting, and some of that took place in London. Took Broadwater Farm being an example of that, but it took place in a range of estates and areas across the country. There was no common factor in architectural terms. It took place in cottage estates. It took place in areas of high-rise housing. What was common was a youth population suffering mass unemployment, bad police-community relations specifically in many cases, and so on. So antisocial behaviour criminality didn't emerge as a result of a walkway or a street in the sky. It emerged because of the context in which those young people were living.
Can I hesitate to, that's quite a long statement. I just want to explore a bit, briefly and in short terms. You use words like deterministic, which I think is a very strong way of expressing it. I don't know that people who, I'm thinking of it, so in my constituency we had Durand Close, which is where the police showed the bill went to film, where they wanted, a gritty urban estate. That's now been redeveloped as mostly terraced housing. We had the Roundshore estate, which was a similar sort of deck access type of thing, now largely been redeveloped as terraced housing. So is your view that though that kind of redevelopment has no effect, small effect? I mean, I'm trying to establish whether you think that the case for kind of street-based development is just overstated, or whether you're saying it's sort of non-existent in comparison with that sort of deck access, concrete jungle type of development.
Well, concrete jungle is a slightly loaded phrase, isn't it?
It is. Perhaps I should declare I grew up on a council estate and I have views about what they're like and the kinds of environment that people enjoy who live on them.
And I respect those views. I respect a range of experiences and views. What I'm avoiding in my own work, I absolutely take on board things that went wrong. My interest is what went wrong. What was the context? What were the circumstances? The main effect of regeneration, of course, as it's been implemented in London, has been to reduce social housing.
Sorry, I don't want to. I want to keep it very focused on this question. Let's imagine you're building a new estate. Are you saying there's a small advantage, a moderate advantage, a large advantage, or no advantage at all to building it, say, in a street-based way, as Charleen was describing, versus in let's say, a Durand Close way with deck access and walkways and those sorts of things? Because it's a sliding scale, isn't it? It's not a binary thing. One is perfect, one is awful.
Well, I mean, in the current context, we're not likely to build another Aylesbury estate because we simply don't have the kind of ambition or will or financial resources or politics that would enable that. But you talked about sort of the concrete jungle. Of course, Aylesbury estate was used as a concrete jungle by Channel 4. The Channel 4 ident in exactly the same way as you're describing the bill using the Durand estate, was it? Mm-hmm. So we know very well how these things can be portrayed, and of course the residents of the Aylesbury estate created their own counter film.
I understand. Just to be sure, I understand what people say. I'm interested in what you're saying. Are you saying there's, on that sliding scale from no effect to massive effect to some sized effect in between, how big an effect does that have, do you think? Because you seem to be suggesting none, but the words you use are quite hard line in terms of, deterministic. I mean, human behaviour isn't deterministic, but it can be influenced. Is there an influence?
In terms of the design?
Yeah.
Hill, talk about.
Well, I'll give you a chance to. I'll come to you next in a moment, Kate.
Well, Kate wants me to talk about Park Hill,
okay.
And that because I'd essentially used the same line there. I mean, we are in a. I mean, I think for me, I'll be frank about this. I think for me, in terms of social housing, and I'm very aware of drawing lessons for all the historical reasons, contextual reasons I'm saying. But I think there was a bit of a golden age for council housing design, and it did learn from some of the missteps of the site. There were missteps, there were errors of scale, I think. And certainly errors in construction due to industrialised building and system building and so on. So that we can learn from. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the best design for me, if I was to select, I would choose Churchill Gardens, which is actually certainly a multi-storey estate, but a very successful community. Great landscaping, big part of that estate is its landscaping and the kind of disposition of otherwise quite large slab blocks. So it's an architectural design and planning quality to that estate, early post-war estate. But secondly, I'd look at the low-rise, high-density. I think we do need high-density housing, obviously, in London and beyond. And the low-rise, high-density housing of the 1970s, I think you talked about Cressingham Gardens, Camberton, of course, takes alongside Lambeth, takes centre stage here with some really superb housing. Alexander Road Estate is, somehow it's a pretty large scale development, but it marries, as does most Camden and Lambeth housing of that era, high density with not conventional streetscape. I don't think we have to. We don't need to return to the kind of sort of boring suburbia, which is favoured by some. But I think if you look at the kind of design and architectural innovation of the 1970s in council housing terms, you can see some really good examples for the future.
Fair enough. Well, I'll finish there except to say that if you grew up on a exciting estate with a high crime rate, boring suburbia is fantastic. That's where I live now. Kate, same question. So what? Just to remind you, the question is about what lessons, good or bad, can we learn from previous generations or iterations of social housing design? And I should say welcome and good morning.
Thank you. I apologise for my late arrival. It's out of my hands, something to do with the DLA transport. I find the volume here is a little bit low. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you great, Kate, but are you able to hear us all right?
Yes.
Would it be helpful for us to speak louder?
I had difficulty hearing the two ladies at the end there.
No problem. I'll just remind all guests and members, just if you bring your microphone a little closer to yourself, bring it down, then we'll make sure everyone in the room can hear.
Yeah. Well, as John already mentioned, I spent the great majority of my years in practice with the public sector, starting off in London. I share the view that John has iterated, that I wouldn't generalise about any particular mode of producing housing for any group, there's good architecture and there's bad architecture. And the Park Hill in Sheffield, which I just referred to, was at one time going to be torn down. And it was only rescued because Urban Splash stepped in and promised to buy it and renovate a tranche at least. And then it got listed, which of course made all the difference. And now, of course, the latest iteration has won every prize going on sustainability, social criteria and everything else. And you probably know that there's a play running, I think it's finished now, at the National Theatre about life on that estate. I think it's the first time that a housing estate has actually been the star of a theatrical production. Anyway, it's quite a story. Now, underlying a lot of what you've been talking about in terms of what's good and bad about social housing, I think, is the writings of Alice Coleman, who John has mentioned. It's extremely questionable methodology. Now, of course, we're into an era where, since 1979, really, the focus has been on selling off public assets and shrinking the state. And it's, according to researchers of Brett
Apologies
Christophers.
for interrupting. I think there are some questions. I don't know if you're talking about right to buy, but some of my colleagues I know have questions about that later.
Right.
So in order to avoid sort of...
I think it'll be all right. I think as opening remarks, we should let Kate have her flow, and
Apologies.
I'm sure some of them won't mind
Thank
if
you. Over 50% of what was at that time public land has been sold off. So a vast amount of what we talk about when we talk about housing is actually down to land and land values. If you bear in mind, as I'm sure you're all aware, on average, 70% of the value of any given house is in the land. Now, what the marketisation of all things is doing is it's placing huge emphasis on the market value of land at the expense of the social value of the edifice which is on that land. And for the person who is occupying that dwelling, of course, it's more than just a dwelling. It's gives significance and meaning to their whole life. It's full of memories and events and so on. And that's not to say that you should never ever demolish, but front, foremost and centred to our thinking today about the built environment must be climate change and trying to reduce emissions. And 40% of the building environment is responsible for 40% of emissions. And the RIBA and the Architects Journal have been running a long campaign on trying to bring forward the proposition that we should first of all consider retrofit. Now, a huge obstacle to this is the imbalance of VAT, 20% on extension and refurbishment, and 0 on new build. Now, that is straightforwardly a gift to the volume house builders, which of course is precisely what the government wants. A lot of the money pouring into their coffers is coming from volume house builders. So we have a totally biased scenario where it's impossible to really examine any estate or tract of land which has got housing on it and do an objective cost-benefit analysis. And we can only do that as and when VAT is equalised across new build and refurbishment. And as examples of this, the way this is working, and of course the starvation of local government with the 50% at least cut in the central government basic fund, is Cressingham Gardens and Central Hill. Well-loved estates. There's an event going on in Central Hill tomorrow, sort of carnival, putting on a show for kids and so on. Those residents have been fighting tooth and nail, year in, year out, to my knowledge, and I've been doing my best to assist them to persuade Lambeth not to demolish. Lambeth, who's been censured by the Housing Ombudsman at least 3 times and is under examination again, won't take them off the demolition list. Now, this is completely not what the world requires at this time when we're facing tornadoes, floods, heat waves, and just climate breakdown, which has got to be more important than any other issue that is facing us at the moment. That's the end of rant.
Did you want to add another mini rant about types of social housing? So we've spoken about, you know, the cottages and you know, very tall towers and various points in between. Are there lessons, good lessons or bad lessons, to be taken from those different types of construction for social housing?
As I said
we should apply?
At the beginning, I don't think that there's any particular formula that I would say if you go for that will be successful everywhere. In my book, when an architect gets a brief, you first of all look at the program, you look at the site, and you look at the planning constraints, and you start off from there. In the case of Dawson's Heights, one of the major considerations was the extremely unstable ground conditions, which meant that any structure erected on that site, I don't know if you're familiar with it, had to be deep driven piles, even a single story. So that meant the logical argument was to limit the footprint of the building. But at the same time, I stepped it down so that the scale at the edges related to the surrounding suburbia. And the other huge peculiarity of that site was the views, which are very rare in South London to get distant views. You can see from there to the Weald of Sussex to the south, and to the north you can see to Parliament Hill on a clear day. So I wanted as many people as possible to have that distant view, and 2/3 of them do. And the other criteria I absolutely insisted on was that there should be a central, car-free, totally safe and casually supervised space, so that most of the buildings look into that space. And consequently, the children, not just from that estate, but from the surrounding area, come into play. And they also run social events, teaching people about bicycle maintenance and so on. I've attended a couple of these events myself. They bring in bouncy castles and all sorts of fun goes on. So far from being a ghetto, it's a hub of activity.
Yeah, I think it's held up as an example of success. So thank you, Kate. If I could finish with you, Alice, again on the same question about lessons, good or bad, from previous types of design.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I am commenting today as an architect who is practicing now, who looks to people like Kate with great admiration and respect, and therefore really interested in this question about what lessons we can learn. And I think it's been touched upon already that sort of the first lesson to learn before we even touch on design is about sort of political context, this idea of seeing housing as basic infrastructure, not as a commodity, this sort of political will that housing is good. Housing is the sort of essential basis of a society which is healthy and happy and creative and productive. So that's kind of a massive context to this. And then also, I guess, with that hand in hand is to say that a lot of what we're talking about today is looking back on places in our city which have had years and years of neglect from governments of all persuasions, and therefore it's really important that we bear that in mind, and John touched on that very clearly too. In terms of design and the lessons that we can learn from design, and what we try to take forward in new projects that we're working on, and we do work with a lot of existing post-war estates and communities who are there. And I have to say, the communities that we meet in those estates are often some of the most tightly knit communities I've ever met in London, and that, I think, is predominantly down to the length of their tenure there. We've worked on estates where people have grandparents there, parents, children. They have an annual day trip to the seaside. 200 people are renting coaches together. It doesn't happen that often in London, and those sorts of places are really quite special. In terms of design, I think there are some really interesting things to learn, particularly we're looking at the sort of work of Kate and her colleagues in around that time working in the public sector. There was a sort of attempt to use design to prioritise public spaces that people could safely gather in, so pedestrianised spaces, Kate was saying, car-free. Often, although not in every situation, they're very street-based. So you look at things like Cressingham Gardens or Alexandra Road, front doors off streets, balconies, terraces, sort of social activity that's activating that space, that's making it feel safer, hopefully, to walk through. It's making it feel well overlooked. There's a sort of attention to the quality of shared space, of play space, too, and in terms of quality of landscape. And access to green space, and we know that's a really intersectional issue in this city. We know that if you look at access to green space by race, black people and other ethnic minorities are really underrepresented in their access to open green space, and I think that's something which we can look to these sort of post-war social housing, something that tried to prioritise. There was also some incredibly innovative housing design, so without embarrassing Kate, just sort of the example that sprung to mind was Dawson's Height, and the sort of really radical idea at the time, which went against GLC convention, to provide housing of different sizes next to each other, which John touched upon in his opening statement, so that you had the sort of design sort of embodiment of sort of creating an opportunity of what Nye Bevan would talk about, that sort of mixed tapestry where you have people who have perhaps different life situations who are perhaps better able to support each other. But also things like putting walkways every 3 floors, so sort of split flat typology, which enabled you to, rather than having sort of a reduced number of people moving through these spaces and you're unlikely to come into contact with your neighbours, trying to sort of push people into closer proximity, so you're more likely to have that social interaction. And we know also, in the present day, I was reading this morning that the Red Cross estimate that 9 million people in England say they feel lonely most or some of the time. So those are really important. When we're talking about design, I have to say that, which might be controversial for John, I really do think that design has a big impact to play in creating opportunities for us to address some of those social issues, and I think there's big lessons to learn that are positive from post-war estates. We also work on estates where there are challenges socially now, which may in part are down to a huge change in socio-economic sort of status of people, as John was touching on as well, in terms of life challenges, but also because some of those the sort of post-war housing did turn its back to the street in an attempt to get away from the car, and so sometimes you do have spaces which do create sort of back gardens onto a street, and you might have a sort of long run of 200-metre wall along the pavement, which actually perhaps isn't ideal in terms of creating public space that feels safe and overlooked. And so there are things that we can sort of learn from that, especially when things are slightly raised up, and they might create a situation where you would only sort of pass through there if you live there. So kind of in a way does sometimes form a bit of a isolated area in a city. So I think, I've talked about the positives very briefly. I think there are other areas in which we can learn from as well in terms of sort of lack of legibility sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And sort of that integration into surrounding streets. And I think when we're working with existing estates where that's not working so well, where perhaps there's deck access that is dead end and you currently have mopeds driving up and down it, which obviously isn't just an architectural issue, and you perhaps have sort of sunken garages which are now not used because cars are bigger and people have less cars, so they're kind of used as storage, so they're not very well occupied. Again, not purely architectural issue, but when we're working in those situations, and maybe this is something we'll come on to, and it's a really important point I want to explain today, the answer is not to demolish that housing necessarily, unless it has become so degraded that it's really not salvageable. If you had a sort of George in the street of housing and the plumbing didn't work, you'd fix the plumbing, you wouldn't knock the street down. So we have to really interrogate what we're doing with the estates that we sort of deemed as being failures, when actually the social infrastructure that exists there is incredibly precious, not just to the people who live there, but to the city and what we can learn from it. And so we're working to sort of re-densify existing estates where there is sort of some land that can happen on, to try to protect those spaces from being demolished and those existing communities who we know will be displaced, and also obviously the huge carbon impact that has. So maybe we'll touch on that in a bit more detail later.
Thanks very much. Just quickly, the two architects on our panel. In your view, have architectural principles changed, let's say, from the turn of the 20th century? Perhaps, Kate, if you wanted to...
Just before
yes,
you come in, I just wanted to welcome the Year 6 Britannia Village Primary School from Newham. Thank you for coming to join us and watch our committee meeting. We're discussing the history of social housing estates and what we can learn from the design. So hopefully you'll find the discussion interesting. I'll pass back over to the guests to answer that, but I'm also conscious that I think 7 to 9, Sian, your questions to Helen Berry, we've kind of gone quite deep into that territory. So what we'll do is we'll probably pass on to you after the guests have answered Assembly Garrett's questions. I think we're going to be doing a bit back and forth because they're also integrated.
Mine.
Does that work?
Because mine are a different topic.
Okay.
They were switched.
Or if you feel like you can divert into a different area, then that's fine.
Very much so.
Back over to you, Assembly Garrett.
Yes. Hello. Welcome, Year 6. So just from so to Kate and to Alice, how perhaps briefly, perhaps I should say on behalf of the chair and for all of us, how have architectural principles changed, do you think, from, say, the turn of the 20th century through until now? You may not have very much to say on it, I don't know.
Well, I'm no longer a practicing architect, but Peter Barber, with whom Alice is an associate director, is the foremost architect in housing in London. I'd like to hand over to Alice in a minute, but they are greatly noted for their sensitive infill in sites which developers reject because they're too problematic, don't lend themselves to their standard approach. They require a bespoke stitching together. And that's not to say that that's the only thing the practice does. I would like to hear Alice talk about their 100-mile city proposal for the perimeter of London, which would, if adopted, make better use of the land and would provide potentially for 40 million people. And this is not the only practice in the world which is advocating this type of approach, and of course protect the green belt, so that, this notorious trade in land which is going on, in which some of our MPs are involved, where you get change of use for agricultural land and you've multiplied its value by 250% overnight for doing absolutely nothing. The Melbourne in Australia, Victoria, the main city in Victoria, has, I'm glad to say, a mayor who Robert Adams, who's an architect, a visionary architect, and he's proposing very similar approach to never gobble up green land and densify in the suburbs.
Fair enough. Well, actually, before you come in, Alice, you were teed up there with a specific thing. I was actually going to say my next question was going to be what are current trends? So it sounds like you could probably do both of those, the historical bit and the current trends, all in one answer, and then that would wrap up my questions.
Peter Barber's the only current trend I'm interested in.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so well, I think, gosh, it's a big question, isn't it? I might talk about current sort of thoughts at the moment, if that's all right first. I might talk about density, and we sort of began this discussion talking about quite sort of low density estates and planning, and obviously we have a limited amount of land. We also, there is a sort of theory that the only way to solve the housing crisis is to build into our countryside, but also simultaneously London is actually a relatively low dense city. If we look at our sort of European counterparts like Paris and Barcelona, obviously Barcelona has a higher sun than we have, but Paris not so much, and I think there are some really interesting places that people go on holiday and come back and say, wow, wasn't that amazing? Are really quite a lot higher density than parts of London is. And so I guess a lot of our work comes about thinking about how we achieve high density where we have scarcity of land and resources, and we have a climate crisis, and how we achieve that in a way which promotes sort of social activity and social action. And so the way in which we try to do that is by having a sort of lower medium rise, high density approach, a sort of street based housing approach, which, as Kate alluded to, is very, very context specific. So it really requires a good understanding of the site challenges, but also a bespoke approach most of the time. Kate alluded to the 100-mile city, which is a kind of theoretical project that Peter was working on a few years ago, which was a sort of counterpart to the idea that the only way we could build the houses we need in London is to build into our green belt. The idea was obviously a sort of fairly polemic one, which was to sort of build a ride of housing around the edge of London, which would be 100 miles long, conveniently, at sort of 200 metres wide, 4 stories tall. That would provide about 2 million new homes with factories, mixed use, productive agriculture on one side, suburbia on the other, and we would densify our city from the outside in. Obviously, that's a big idea, and one which sort of explored to sort of see where the challenges lie and kind of and sort of push to that extent. But it also looked at how we connect London up. London transport system, we've got sort of the overground line, haven't we? And we've got the inner circle line, but actually when you're thinking about the outer London boroughs, how we connect those up, you end up coming into the city to come back out again. And so it also looked at that sort of radial route pushing out, which I think is a huge thing for equity in our city, particularly when we think about gender equity, who does most of the care work in our society, etc. And so when we're thinking about housing design, currently we're thinking about how we achieve that without perhaps going very tall, pushing our buildings further apart. And what that means is that we're pushing buildings slightly closer together, but we're creating streets that are active, where people can sort of see their neighbours and get to know their neighbours, that are activated by balconies. And the other, very briefly to finish on that point, the other benefit of that, which is derived from a kind of social ambition, is that financially, if you are building housing which has front doors onto a street, so you're looking at things like I mentioned earlier, like the Warner flats where you might come in at ground floor level access, but you might have another flat adjacent to it where you come straight in, you're not building any communal internal circulation. And in that instance, you're therefore, in comparison to a sort of typical flatted building, saving about 20% of your internal area. So financially, if a local council is building housing in that way, you can build for 20% less of your build cost, which in this current climate is very useful and is a sort of secondary thing to the social. Oh, I've offended the children. Sorry, I better finish up. Bye. And And so, that comes from a sort of social ambition, but it also has wider benefits, and it also means you can achieve the same densities up to a certain point. Obviously, you can't compete with a sort of 12-storey tower, but up to a certain point, you can achieve the same densities with more sensitive massing, which is obviously crucial when we're sort of trying to work with communities and planning officers. I think I might just end there, if that's all right.
Thank you very much. Just one super fast final question, just some numbers. When you talk about low, medium, high, very tall, roughly what number of floors would they be in your mind?
So when we're talking about low to medium, and what we would be looking at, housing which you can walk up, so up to 4 or 5 stories, so 5 being where the top 2 floors might be maisonettes, and that's sort of pushing it to its extreme, really.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman Garrett. Over to yourself, Assemblyman Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair. So to explain, I think we've talked quite a lot about circulation space, as you just did again there, Alice, and also sort of outdoor space, as I think Kate laid out quite well in terms of Dawson's heights. So I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about community spaces more generally, community buildings. This is something, I'm slightly in love with the Grove Park Youth Club in Lewisham, which is built alongside an estate in a very particular style, purpose-built as a youth club. I'm very aware that a lot of meetings I go to are in purpose-built community centres, including within Cressingham Gardens, a very nice sort of rotunda-style community centre there. So I wanted to ask each of you, but I think I'll start with Charleen, because you're currently involved in projects now. What kinds of community facilities and spaces are coming alongside these new estates? I know there's guidance from the Mayor on playgrounds, for example. There's guidance from the Mayor saying these have to be accessible to all of the different tenures now after some controversy, and also there's a growing need for things like health services being brought more into the community. So how is architectural design helping with that side of community space?
Thank you for your question. In terms of my experience, community space is really a vital and important part of the estate regeneration projects that I've been involved with. And that's helping in terms of sort of pre-planning, post-planning. There are areas, say for example, Clapham Park Estate, that has a temporary space at the moment, which is providing a sports facility, a space for IT, training, space for people to learn knitting and stitch work, and it's a really vital and important space for not only existing residents but also new residents, and to just bring them together in terms of like social cohesion. I think it's a really important part, and I think in terms of sort of that interim period of finishing an estate, which can take up to maybe 15 to 25 years in terms of Clapham Park Estate, having temporary facilities as well in that interim is really vital, and they're providing that. At Oval Quarter, they have a place quite centrally at the heart of the estate. It's this really dynamic building, which is the community hub. And again, it's next to the Muga, provides facilities.
Can you explain Muga for the audience?
It's a multi-use games area, I think is the term. And it's associated with the community facility, providing shower facilities to people who rent the space. And again, it's a really vital part of the community. In terms of the London plan, there is the policy in terms of community infrastructure and planning for that in large master plans. So there is that sort of requirement in terms of providing these facilities as part of estate renewal.
Okay, thank you. Can I take the question to Kate now? I know you've designed specialist sheltered housing. Again, that might have different requirements for community space and facilities.
The last job I and my late partner designed was an adventure playground in a poor estate. I say poor because it's high unemployment on the outskirts of Southampton. So it was great way to end a career because it won an RIBA award. But when I am critting student schemes on housing, I always advise them, think first of all about the interests of the children. If you can make a place good for children, it will be good for women. If it's good for women and children, it would also be good for men. So you start off with the children and encourage, but in no way force, conviviality, so that the opportunities are on offer, but nobody is denied the possibility to retreat and find privacy if that is what they want. And I applied that also in my sheltered housing scheme, which is visually a totally different aesthetic to Dawson's Heights. But for elderly people, of course, loneliness can be a big problem. And when I went back there now almost 10 years ago, having not visited in decades, I was told that it's on a rather backland suburban site, so there's not a lot of activity around. But I located the common room on the road frontage beside the main entrance. So everybody walking down the covered way to coming and going from the site gets to pass the common room, and they can peep in and see if there's someone there and exchange the time of day. So these sorts of casual interchanges apparently work well and have been encouraged. Now, of course, it's been terribly vandalised and abused by Lambeth and is actually at risk, despite having been listed. But when I was working at Lambeth, it was the policy that all housing estates incorporated some communal facility which would also be used by the surrounding community, so that that became a linkage between the people living in the council estate and the surrounding community to avoid this sense of ghettoisation. And that George Finch designed Lambeth Towers. Originally that had a doctor's group practice, a registrar's office, and an old person's luncheon club, which is now a restaurant. So this was a very enlightened sort of policy that Lambeth had at that time.
Thank you very much. Alice, I know you've said already that a lot of the work you do is kind of infill and smaller sites of very tight conditions. How do you feel about this principle of including community facilities for the whole area in designs that you work on, and if you're able to do so?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important. So when we work on infill sites, but we also work on bigger sites where we're sort of rethinking, a couple of hundred homes, and often our projects sort of vastly exceed. So we've just done a project on TfL land which had a capacity study for about 30 homes, and we've got 97 on there with a local corner shop and a cafe. And really fundamentally to that is a sort of thinking about our city being, I think, about 70% by and large housing. So when we're thinking about a housing project, we're thinking about it as a piece of city. It's not, it needs to relate to the surrounding area. It needs to understand what those needs are and provide for those. And so I think that's really important. And just briefly add to that, Kate's point about sort of thinking about children, the sort of process in which we design. When someone sort of says, what does inclusive design look like? I think so often it's actually about the process of the design and whose voices are around the table, who's are excluded, not just in terms of who's doing the designing, but who's procuring it, etc. And so the sort of community uses that we might look to and that you're sort of working on, Charleen, kind of need to be informed by a whole host of different voices, and there are brilliant people like Make Space for Girls looking at what sort of play space might work well for young girls, and really doing some sort of meaningful engagement, and the outcomes are quite surprising often. And there are other people like Matt and Fiona who are working with school children. It was brilliant to see the children in earlier today to sort of get involved in those processes and sort of think about what those uses might be, and also the sort of fantastic role that the Welsh Government have for the Commissioner for Future Generations, who's able to kind of, as I understand it, kind of call in projects from sort of an infrastructural scale to smaller scales to think about the impact they have on future generations. And I think that all ties into the community uses being a really integral part when we're thinking about housing, has to include those.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. John, do you have anything to add to this? We haven't got much time left, but I thought it is that obviously it's something you must have thought about.
Yeah, and I won't waffle on, and I will absolutely defer to the architectural and planning expertise on both sides. No, I'm just very interested. I mean, I'm struck by this as an issue that's been sort of central to council housing design, as I will call it, over many decades, emerging in the 1930s. I think what's interesting, and you kind of referenced it with Grove Park, is the kind of ambition of the post-war welfare state, where Grove Park also included, of course, a club room for the elderly people, which has subsequently been demolished. The Pepys Estate in Lewisham, which included also that club room and play facilities and you name it, health centres and so on, all around the concept of a neighbourhood unit, where people would, a community of 5,000 people who would have every facility, what we now call a 15-minute city. So it's interesting that these things are coming back. It's great that you're talking about it, and it's always been a tension. It's always a tension with council housing, social housing and planning as to what we will invest, what we can afford or think we can afford. So a lot of this idealism wasn't fulfilled in terms of that range of community facilities, but it's great that you're talking about it, and I just hope that, when going forward, that these things are implemented, because I think they're really important.
And Christine, you had your hand up.
Yes, I'd just like to say briefly that a lot of these ideas about community provision do go back to the early days of social housing. The first Peabody architect, Henry Derbyshire, aimed to design his blocks as far as possible grouped around central courtyards, so there was a play space for children, and this is in the 1860s and 1870s. And of course there were communal bathhouses and communal laundries. In the early 20th century, when a new architect was designing for Peabody, Victor Wilkins, who designed for them from Edwardian times right up to 1948, he started introducing things like a community hall on some estates, where there would be lectures and entertainments. And in more recent times, it started perhaps on a modest scale with things like lunch clubs for the elderly, school holiday play arrangements for children, outings to the country. Street parties have always been very popular on the estates for big national events, but in more recent times there's been even more emphasis on community provision, with the recognition particularly that it isn't enough just to provide people with housing if they hadn't got jobs. They're going to be living on housing benefit, and therefore if you can help them get into employment, that is something else that we can provide. So we began with a range of what we call digivans. The vans went round to different estates and they were equipped with computers and learning IT tuition for residents, not just necessarily for our own residents, but for people in the immediate area, and job training, helping people to compile CVs, training them in doing job applications. So there's been a good deal of that in social housing, outside council housing as well.
Thank you very much. Chair, am I right to ask the next question 8?
Yes, go for it.
Great, okay. So I'm just going to open up a whole can of worms, that's why I'm checking on time. So I don't know who would want to answer this first. Maybe I'll start with Alice. You must be looking at this as a practising architect. We wanted to know how the design of social housing in the UK now compares to its European counterparts. Are we diverging from any trends in that respect?
That's a really interesting question. I'd love to go away and have some time to sort of properly investigate it. And
if you want to write to us with any thoughts, that would probably help, because we obviously want to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are obviously some really interesting examples, like in Vienna, where there really never was a massive sell-off of social housing, and so sort of the social economics of it, I guess, are very different to what we have here. I guess your question perhaps is more about design and wary of time, not wanting to sort of open up that side of it, but just to recognise that I think in Vienna, is it 60%?
That's right.
Of people live in council housing. It's considered normal, as it was here. We had well over half our population living in council housing at one stage, I think. So there's that sort of context which differs, and I think Uruguay is another example of that. In terms of the design, I think there are some really interesting examples. Again, I'd look to Vienna, where they have some really interesting policy which is thinking about inclusion and diversity within the built environment. So they have a policy which is, I can't remember its full title, but it's essentially gender mainstreaming in urban planning. Sort of the idea, and this isn't just a gender issue, needs to be an intersectional consideration, but the idea that you place decisions about equity at the forefront of design. Is this serving people equally, which I think is quite an interesting way, and a really vital way actually of designing our cities. And that provides design guidance, but also, as I mentioned before, a guidance about process. And then I think there's also a sort of, a very sensitive topic about how we're building the materials that we're using. So we are seeing places like Paris say that 50% of public buildings need to be built with natural materials. We obviously have the reverse in London with public housing, that we can't be building in timber. And that's a very complex and sensitive issue, understandably, but I think when we're thinking about the climate crisis and you can put PVC windows in something but you can't build in timber frame, we have to sort of interrogate some of those things too, where the sort of power lies in those decisions and how we're building sustainably. So perhaps less about the exact housing design, but more about sort of urban principles and the materials and the way in which we're sort of thinking about reducing embodied carbon.
Okay, one more question to you, if that's all right. Obviously, there are a lot of former communist countries in Europe, and obviously communist housing is used as a pejorative term quite a lot of the time, but some of the estates I'm aware of are built very much around those principles of having everything in one place and different communities. They might not look like the Create Streets diagrams that you see sometimes, but they are functioning places. Is there a movement to rethink that kind of housing, or demolish in the same sorts of ways as there have been here?
I think
that you're aware of.
Yeah, I think there are. I'm sure others can contribute more.
I'll put the same question to the others.
Yeah,
as well.
I think the sort of thing that springs to mind is thinking about how domestic labour was shared. So some of the examples I'm thinking of in, I guess, more communist housing types had sort of communal laundries, drying spaces that would be shared kitchens, even spaces which tried to sort of rethink how that the sort of burden of domestic labour was shared amongst communities, and things like care work, childcare, etc. And that kind of played out in the architectural design of spaces, I think, as far as I'm aware. Might be wrong, but just sort of thinking of the small examples I know of that did impact the design of those spaces. And I know there are some interesting work being done by a collective called Edit, looking at communal laundries again and the sort of sharing of those spaces. And then in terms of sort of demolition, I could talk for ages about that, but maybe that's another question that's in the wings. We really shouldn't be demolishing housing in this city unless it's really essential to do so. And we believe there are really creative and financially viable ways to re-densify London without demolishing existing buildings.
Okay, thank you. Charleen, you must be in contact with other cities in some of your work. What thoughts do you have on European comparisons?
I haven't had much experience of that. I've only been at the GLA for quite a short time, and so my focus has really been at a local level for the last over 10 years. So I don't have that much experience.
Okay, no worries. If you can go in, maybe ask the team if they've, because I know there probably are visits to European cities and to talk about that kind of thing. It would be really useful to have. Sure. And Kate, I think you were indicating.
Yes. Before I came to work in London, I spent nearly 2 years working in Scandinavia. And there it's a very old tradition is cooperative housing, which provides and has provided for probably over a century about a third of their housing stock. In this country, there is a suppressed demand for co-housing. It's suppressed because of the difficulty of getting hold of land, because the landholders generally like to deal with the big boys, and cooperatives can take a while to assemble their finances. But there's a very noted example in Germany, just very near the French border, Vauban, which is a suburb of Freiburg, to which is linked by a rapid transit route. And they have this very sensible law in Germany that where a tranche of public land is declared surplus to requirement, it must be offered first of all locally, and only if no bid or interest comes forward is it then offered nationally. And the Vauban site had been a large military barracks, and it just so happened that in Freiburg there were 3 housing cooperatives, all with the shared intention of building in the best possible sustainable practice manner to cut down on emissions, and they got together and put in a bid and were successful. So now you have this, by this time, pretty much complete development of a small satellite town, really, which is over 2,000 dwellings and comprises all the facilities that you need for a 15-minute city, schools, health facilities, and along the main drag where the rapid transit route penetrates the town, that's where the business is concentrated. And it's designed to be cycle friendly. So a friend of mine who went there, interested to research this, said at the tourist office, "Can I have a map of the cycle routes?" And they said, "Well, what do you mean? You cycle everywhere here." And so the majority of people who went to live there already had abandoned their cars, but of the remainder that still had a car, their ownership dropped substantially. So they have, instead of a car park, they have a cycle park. And it's forbidden to park your car outside your dwelling. You can have deliveries and pickups from your dwelling by vehicle, but you cannot leave your car there, which means you come out of your front door and you don't automatically do, as you do in Winchester, step across the pavement and get in your car, so you hardly know what it's like to walk on the terribly ill-maintained pavements. You have to think, am I going to walk, am I going to cycle, or am I going to walk to the parking house and pick up my car? And in the parking houses, they have CHP, community-generated power, with photovoltaic arrays and so on. So the houses are all designed to be carbon neutral. So that's well worth a visit. Now, going back to cooperatives for a minute, I see in the London plan that you talk about there's a policy for seeking out different models for expanding social housing to determine the potential contribution each can make to expanding supply. Now, I would urge that you look at requiring volume house builders to set aside a part of their site dedicated for the building of co-housing. And there have been and are a few very interesting examples of co-housing, despite this difficulty and suppression. The biggest one, of course, is the Coin Street Builders, which along the South Bank, which opened up a pedestrian route, which, as you know, now goes through to Tower Bridge and beyond, and contributed 3 pedestrian parks, and was all really the result of Ken Livingstone winning the election for the LCC and withdrawing the consent for what would have been a huge commercial development of offices and hotels. So now you've got this public benefit. And then the smaller scheme, of course, you've got Walter's Way in Lewisham, which was self-built using the Walter Siegel method. And there's recently this community land trust house, a citizen's house in Sydenham. That, and of course, with co-housing, you avoid right to buy. Now, really, evading right to buy should be a major, major preoccupation for you in promoting social housing in London. 40%, as you know, of homes which were built as social homes in London in the 60s and 70s are now in the hands of private landlords.
Yeah, we'll be asking more about that later on as well.
And astronomic escalation in rents.
Thank you so much. Chair, I'll hand back to you now.
Thank you very much. And the panel is absolutely finger on the pulse. We actually have a report coming out from the committee, hopefully later this year, all around the whole life carbon assessment when it comes to demolish versus refurb, but more generally just ensuring that we reduce the carbon in the built environment. I think it was yourself, one of the members sort of said 40% of our carbon emissions in the UK comes from the built environment. In London, it's 68%. So it's a huge contribution to the climate crisis, and we take it very seriously on the committee and in the GLA, and we'll be coming back to that topic. Right, I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Baker, who I think just was going to come in a little later, but I'm going to pass over some questions that have been shaped around. I think we'll give you this section to finish off, and then we'll break for 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'm going to move your question 15 into the next section, Assembly Member Berry, so we can have a bit of a break in between them.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks so far to the panel. It's been absolutely fascinating, and if you'll indulge me for a second, I grew up on a council estate. I grew up on a 1970s concrete council estate that doesn't exist anymore, which was very exciting, but I had a very happy childhood. And I now live absolutely on the edge of the Becontree estate, which I find endlessly fascinating. So this subject is possibly one of my favourites, but don't tell the Transport Committee that. So I've got some questions. I'm going to touch upon well-being and design, which we've talked about a little bit already, but I want to give a chance to fill in any gaps. Then I've got just a question on sort of the political landscape and how that's affected social housing, which we've also cut upon. And then I'm going to return to the subject of high-rise estates and some of the negative perceptions and maybe that sort of perceived conflict between high-rise and streets. So that's what I'm going to be asking. So firstly, returning to well-being, I know we've talked a little about community space and also sort of infrastructure that benefits well-being, but I just want to give the opportunity to fill in anything else. So both to those who design, the architects, and also to those who don't, how do elements of design shape the well-being of residents? What aspects of it can do? And for those who who in a position to influence that, how do you carry that through to design? Does that make sense? I'm trying to wrap up into one.
Thanks, Ellie. Just some sort of initial thoughts, I guess, comes back, without sounding like a broken record, to how we plan, how it's sort of urban design of housing. So, you know, we start our housing projects by thinking about them as a piece of city, how they're arranged, how they connect to surrounding streets, and how houses are accessed. So again, that comes back to the thing I was saying earlier about the sort of that Red Cross statistic that sort of estimated 9 million people in the UK say they feel lonely most or some of the time, and the design of housing and how we relate them to each other, we believe really can affect the ability for people to get to know each other and see if their neighbours drawn their curtains, for example, or not. And then we also have obviously significant challenges in London in terms of air quality, noise pollution. We have sites which are sort of deemed to be undevelopable, particularly sort of along major transport infrastructure like the North Circular, for example, where there are very challenging conditions to put new housing. And so we are working with different housing types to try and to use design to try and improve those situations. So to give a sort of tangible example, in the hope that it's not too abstract, and sort of forgive me for using an example that I've worked on, but just because it's familiar, we've just worked on a site which is alongside the North Circular, on land previously kept aside for possible road widening, which is no longer happening. And it's a site which on one side has big suburban housing, and on the other side has the North Circular, which is 6 lanes. So it has immense challenges of air pollution and noise. And we have worked to design housing which essentially creates a sort of physical barrier for the sort of air pollution, noise pollution, to create a pedestrianised Mews Street the other side of it. So there's housing which in many ways faces and overlooks the North Circular, but its access is from this space, which is this new pedestrian tree-lined Mews Street, where those homes are accessed from. So they have all their ventilation coming from that space, their dual aspect. So they have the, you know, in fact, most of them are triple aspect. So they have outlooks, but they also have the ability to cross-ventilate. Regardless, they're designed in a way which means that their ventilation only relies on coming from that side, which is better protected. So the air pollution is sort of, you know, resolved for those homes. And in terms of noise, obviously the provision of acoustic glazing, etc., and some more detailed ways of looking at it. So, you know, design of our housing is so fundamentally important to our health and well-being, not just our physical health in terms of air pollution, but and noise, but also to our mental well-being in terms of social connectivity, having spaces which are bright and airy. And so, you know, it's good to see an encouragement of homes that are dual aspect, and you know, it's really important that we start to think about how our housing and how not just the design of the homes themselves can protect against air pollution and noise, but also how our projects link up with that wider infrastructure and promote sustainable transport. Like Kate was sort of using examples in Scandinavia about how we try to, you know, use our sort of smaller sites as well to promote that too.
Thank you. Kate, did you have anything to add to that? Sorry, I was speaking very quietly there. Kate, did you want to add anything to come in on that?
Yes, I would like to. I have become rather out of touch with what are the constraints on architects these days because of not practicing, but I have the impression, observing the overdevelopment of sites on the major train routes coming into London, that a lot of the planning requirements about not overlooking right to light, providing open space per head of the population for which a building is designed, have all been subjected to the bonfire of the regulations. So that, returning to my premise that you start with the children, these Alcatraz developments are just so totally inhumane. And the political stance of this government, and possibly the intermediate government, has been to knock planning as a very fashionable and popular thing to do. Combat planning, I say. It's the only way you are going to get a handle on these volume house builders. Otherwise, we are totally naive if we think that house builders are ever going to put people first. Their central obligation, like any commercial outfit, is to turn the maximum profit for their shareholders, and incidentally thereby to up the salary of their CEO. So you've got to control these guys. It's like asking a shark, please don't eat the minnows. And well-being, once again, turning to Vauban. In Vauban is a very, very child-friendly development. They have children's playgrounds everywhere. They're not fenced off. They don't need to be, because they're not subjected to traffic fumes. They're not no one's going to run the kids over. They could just wander free. Similarly, for the elderly, of whom I'm now one, they can hobble along at their own pace, and it's all going to be quite safe. And then, of course, allocation of green space is terribly important. And they found in hospital design that even having a view of a tree can make a phenomenal time in the right direction to the recovery of a patient, as compared with living in a totally, or lying in bed in a totally windowless room. We need this connectivity, both with nature and with other human beings.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kate. Charleen, do you have anything about how well-being is designed into social housing?
Thank you. I think both have done a really good sort of analysis of all of the important things that need to be considered, and some of them are about adequate and quality communal space and open space, making places safe, having sports facilities and thinking about children and how they interact with space. It's also about taking opportunities to think about how you can encourage food growing, allotments. I've seen that on a lot of estates. And I think social housing has a really good opportunity to create community and well-being. I think just in terms of the volume of people and the facilities that could be provided to sort of encourage well-being and consider, I think Kate just mentioned about isolation, and I think it has a really great opportunities to provide those kind of facilities. And in terms of a policy aspect, that's why we have the Housing Design Standards, LPG, to try and secure some of those basic requirements as a minimum. Obviously, as officers at local and regional level, we try to promote further than the minimum, but there is a base level that we expect from developers. And that's scrutinised at local, regional level, and in terms of design review panels as well, providing that independent scrutiny. And for me, as an officer, I always try to put myself in the space of anybody who's living in that environment and walk myself through it. And how does it feel? What is it like? And I think those are quite integral things to consider when reviewing an application.
Thank you. Thanks, Charleen. Christine and John, have you got anything in terms of sort of in the historical context of how social housing has or hasn't benefited well-being, and you know, where we are today on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well-being. Well, the most important thing is having a secure, affordable and decent home. And that's what council housing has produced, as I said already, for many millions over the years. And that's why we need to build more social rent housing. That's the biggest contribution. And of course, you're absolutely right to talk about quality and the very good design and planning principles that people have alluded to. But before we agonise too much, we actually just need to be building more social rent housing. Secure, affordable, decent housing, and that's the contribution of council housing, social housing, historically and in the present. And just to Kate really kind of took the wind from my sails, and I was certainly going to mention private developers. I mean, personally, I find it fascinating. This is a very kind of not a very useful contribution, maybe it's slightly iconoclastic kind of intervention, but I find it fascinating that we have these kind of agonising discussions about the quality of social housing. Nobody gives a toss about you quite rightly picked me up about boring suburbia. I love suburbia. I just don't want to see it replicated in inner London, on a cleared council estate. But that aside, we don't have this conversation about middle-class housing, suburban housing, and we let private developers. No private developer gives a toss about. Sorry, excuse my language. Am I allowed to say that? They don't give a. They don't care, as Kate said, about any of this stuff we're talking about. It's about profit and volume construction. So it's great that we're having this conversation about building high-quality social housing. But let's not kind of torture ourselves over our inadequacies and our lack of aspiration, because actually we've delivered. Local government has delivered housing in a form and a range that private speculative building hasn't. So let's be proud of what we've achieved, and let's be proud going forward of what we can and should be doing.
Can I ask John, do you think, apologies Kristen, I'll give you if you want to come in a second, this torturing about good quality design, everything, do you think that's driven by residents or is that driven by something else? Because where we haven't, obviously this is a panel of experts and you are all fantastic, but where are the residents in this? What do they want? And do you think that attention to that is driven by residents or is it coming from elsewhere?
I don't think it's driven by residents. I think absolutely. I mean, council housing has been terribly paternalistic and top down. That's the historical reality. People didn't, again, to overuse this word, agonise about consultation and so on. And we can correct that. That's an error. We should be talking to residents and tenants, and building on their experience and their interests and aspirations. But in terms of, why do we have this? Why are we sitting and having this conversation? Why do we have this conversation about council housing? We have it because of the middle class media commentariat and how council housing is portrayed in the media. The media coverage of a council estate will be about whatever the particular problem is. It won't be about the thousands of people getting on with their lives, using council housing as a springboard to their best future. It's the media commentariat is the media commentary will always focus on the negative, and we need to be accentuating the positive and celebrating that history.
Thank you. Thanks, Christine. Did you want to come in?
Just say something briefly that some years ago Peabody moved much more towards consultation with its residents about any improvements, changes and so on existing estates, and then in the year 2009 we brought out a publication as a result of a long programme that we undertook to produce something called 21st Century Peabody. It was we used IPPR, De Montfort University and Farrell Architects to do a lot of consultation and produced this document which really aims to outline what we think we should be doing in building new estates in the future, reflecting the needs and wants of residents.
Thanks, Christine. Alice, did you want to?
Yeah, sorry, just very briefly.
Yeah,
I know
sure.
we have planning policy in the London Plan in place for things like overheating and quantifiable aspects like daylight sunlight. But this is not an answer. But I wonder whether there is, as Charleen was talking about, the sort of challenges perhaps within local authorities of holding, schemes that are coming through the planning system to account. I just wonder whether there is more of a way in which London Plan or planning policy for London boroughs can demand more of the less quantifiable, less tangible aspects of well-being in projects, and require a demonstration of that somehow. That's not an answer, I'm afraid.
No, thank you. No, all of the panel's thoughts are really welcome on all this. Thank you. I'm going to move on. I'm absolutely smashing up against the time, I'm afraid. Apologies, Chair. Just to move on to some of the political context, to John, what impact did the 1988 Housing Act have on the management of social housing?
Well, I guess you're talking primarily about stock transfer.
Yes.
And obviously, essentially, Mrs. Thatcher thought that councils, local authorities, were poor managers of council housing, and she thought that housing associations would manage more flexibly and responsively. So I think there was an idealism there. I think there was a lot of idealism with Mrs. Thatcher. I don't think it always worked out in practice, but that's a political discussion. So I think that, the intention, of course, was to encourage stock transfer, to move council housing into the third sector, housing association sector. In fact, most stock transfer occurred under New Labour, because basically New Labour shared that philosophy, and they financially compelled local authorities to transfer housing stock through their the financial regime of the Decent Home Standard in 2000. So this is the long story. So essentially, of course, whereas housing associations formed a very small component of the social housing sector, into the 1980s they now form about half of it. So we have about 17-18% of people living in social rent housing, and it's roughly half and half in terms of local authorities and housing associations. Now, I don't have a dog in the fight, so whatever works for me, and if the private sector could develop good low rental affordable housing, great. And if housing associations can manage better than councils, great. I think the issue is, and I think the point we've reached now, and this has been pretty well publicised in recent years, is that housing associations, through a process of merger, kind of corporatisation in a sense, increasingly viewing themselves as housing developers rather than kind of philanthropic providers. I think we're in a mess now, and I think a lot of the problems that were apparent or allegedly apparent in local authority management and ownership are now equally, if not more, apparent with housing associations. So I guess that's I guess that's my answer.
Could I make a contribution on that subject? In 2017, state spending on social housing, that's to say the housing associations, fell from 0.7 of GDP to 0.2, resulting in government grants, reduction in government grants to housing associations. And this was the primary cause of the fall in their construction programme, and the loss of housing capacity of 88,000 households was forecast by them, and it cast about 1 million households onto the unregulated private rented sector.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. And just following up on that, in terms of John, about an hour and a half ago, I think, you made a comment about post-war views about who council housing was for, and the fact that we now talk about mixed communities, and actually those council estates were mixed communities, and there's been a real change. And that's changed over, at different times, political views about who council housing, who social housing is for, and that Housing Act is, I think, part of that change, part of that change of those views. And obviously the funding of social housing is also linked into that. Who is it for? Is it for everyone, or is it for a small number? And this is, for me, this underpins a whole load of the questions here. So I'm not even sure if it's a question that can be answered or whether I'm just making a statement. But how much do that changing political views about the goodness and badness of social housing affect the design, affect the resources that are put into good design and well-being and everything like that? How much of that is what we're seeing today is to do with the political landscape about who social housing is for?
Yeah, that probably is quite difficult to answer, I think, isn't it?
Sorry.
I mean, anyway, obviously we agree, I think, in terms of the political landscape is hugely important, and that and the attitude towards social housing. Actually, the thing I just want to kind of circle back very quickly to a previous point, because I talked about the media commentary and that stuff, the agonising. And of course, essentially, we're talking about class. Council housing is for social housing is for working class people, and mostly working class people are commented on, observed, improved or not by the middle classes. So that is a big context for any discussion around council housing, social housing. I think Kate quite rightly, and obviously the cardinal reality is finance. Well, two cardinal realities: political will and ambition, and finance. But within that context, I would haven't always got everything right. But I think actually the quality of social housing has maintained. Has been maintained. Parker Morris standards, space standards, of course, were abolished by Mrs. Thatcher, but have been generally adopted voluntarily by local authorities and are still so. Obviously, and I'm sure this is probably a topic we're going to come back to, it's been alluded to already in terms of building sustainable housing, passive house, and so on. Local authorities, again, are taking the lead. And again, in contrast, if we're looking at some kind of equivalent kind of private sector development for lower income families and individuals, there's no contrast. I mean, social housing is infinitely superior. And we need to, obviously enable that as fully as we can by supporting it politically as best we can and financially.
Thanks, John. Alice and then Kate, thank you.
Got a little anecdote on this. My late partner, George Finch, who worked in the LCC on housing, he did quite a lot in the East End, and he was told that a spec builder put up some housing close to his, was annoyed because the residents who'd bought into his scheme were complaining that the local authority residents had better housing than they did. And so that got back to the politicians. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are 34,000 homes in London long-term empty, and at the same time we have 10,000 rough sleepers. That seems to indicate to me that GLA ought to be looking at compulsory purchase. And of course, when you look at Westminster, which has actually been looking at compulsory purchase, one area of the city, 53% of the homes are empty. They're just there as asset boxes.
Yep.
For protecting the wealth of probably some pretty nasty Russian oligarchs.
Thank you, Kate. Alice.
Thank you. Just very quickly on that, it's interesting the empty home situation we have in this country, and then London has its own nuances of challenges. Some are empty because they're empty, a long-term investment, and some are empty because they're pension funds, and as Kate was saying. But it does also come into how we're thinking about designing. So, if you're designing, if a house builder is designing to sell these to people who are not going to be living in them, they will design them in a different way to if you're designing for people to be living in them. So that's a whole other discussion. But that's about building with foyers, concierges, fancy areas that kind of have many methods of protection before a front door, not about building street-based, socially active housing. So I think that's another issue about it's a whole kind of issue about investment and land. But just very quickly on your question, which was about perhaps a stigma of social housing, it being so depleted in numbers that it's reserved for the most in need in our society now, and therefore the in its dark brilliance, the reducing of numbers to kind of undermine it further and further, and that cyclical effect. 10 years ago, we would do consultations, and occasionally, more often than not, people would be objecting to social housing because of this stigma of what the tenants might be like, which was very hard to experience, having grown up with parents who grew up in council housing, and working with residents who just best communities that I've ever experienced in London. That is noticeably changing in our experience. People are in our recent projects are not having that view anymore. I'm saying this is really brilliant. We need good quality housing for people on lower incomes in our neighbourhoods and our boroughs, and so that's a positive. In terms of the design of it, how that impacts the design, I think obviously the majority of social housing is produced by local authorities. They are incredibly cash strapped at the moment. We saw, and therefore that does impact the design, because not that good design costs more necessarily, but you have to have good consultants, a good inclusive process that takes money to do consultation properly and engagement, and you need those resources to produce good quality housing in our city, whether it's social housing or affordable housing or private sale. We saw Michael Gove, I know this is a central government issue, but we saw Michael Gove give back 1.9 billion to the Treasury because he simply couldn't get rid of it. The local authorities in London and around the country are not sitting there thinking we've got enough cash, thanks. So, an interesting thing for, I guess, London Assembly is how within those constraints do we make sure that the production of social housing is properly funded, and therefore we can be thinking about community spaces because we can afford to invest in them, we can make them financially stable, we can afford to engage in inclusive design processes, and we can afford to design in a way which not only benefits the people that are going to live there but benefits the surrounding communities too.
Thanks, Alice. That's really helpful, and certainly I think the politicians, I agree with you, and I think the politicians are lagging around in terms of what perception is for social housing these days. But okay, I am about to smash through my second extended deadline, so I'm going to try and cover. We have touched on this before, and this is about high-rise estates and a lot of the ones that have actually now been demolished. If I can ask John. I want to specifically ask about one aspect as well. We have touched upon this before. What factors do you think contributed to the negative perceptions of high-rise estates? And can you comment on defensible space and the theory that that we touched upon earlier in the session?
Yeah, wow, that's you could write a book about that, couldn't you?
You could.
Yeah, I mean, high-rise is an interesting one. Now, as I say, that kind of drive towards multi-storey housing came in, I think, for very plausible, very positive reasons. in the post-Second World War period, there was certainly an assumption that higher stories wouldn't house young families, which was observed in early years, but increasingly and powerfully not observed subsequently. So I think it's a straightforward issue about who is housed in a tower block. And it should be people essentially that want to be housed in a tower block. And the point is, of course, lots of people did. They were quite perfectly happy. They loved the views. They back in the 50s, they got fresh air up there, which they didn't in smog-ridden on the smog-ridden London lower floors. So, you know, my experience is that, and my sort of perception from the lived experience, I suppose, of others historically, is that there's no inherent problem with high-rise housing. And of course, you know, given that it's now the sort of the default for the sort of new private developments, it does make you question this whole basic kind of narrative around horrible high-rise council housing, whereas we have this lovely middle-class, you know, high-rise. I'm not sure quite what the difference is, probably apart from space standards, which were superior, and facilities which were superior in council housing. I think the main problem with high-rise, if we're talking about tower blocks in the early years, is that the lifts frequently didn't work, you know, there's two things. So firstly, I mean, it's such a kind of banal observation, but it's actually pretty powerful in practice. The lifts had to be reliable, and they weren't very reliable in early years, quite frequently. And I think that's probably been fixed now. I hope so. And secondly, there's certainly issues around safe space, a concierge on the ground floor, keeping those stairwells and lifts free from unpleasant intrusion and antisocial behaviour and so on. So obviously, council house residents are entitled to the same kind of secure by design safeguards around front doors and shared space as anybody else. But yeah, I would reject the notion that high-rise housing isn't and can't be absolutely good, decent housing for the people that want it, and that's a wide range of the population. People don't want gardens, people who do want the views, etc., etc. Defensible space, well, that's a biggie, isn't it? I mean, I think as we have mentioned, I think methodologically, there's no doubt that Alice Coleman's surveys were incredibly flawed, and there was one massive element which he didn't control for, which was you know, social and economic circumstances of the residents that she was talking about or observing. You know, and Alice Coleman comes to the fore at a particular moment in social housing history. She comes to the fore in the 1980s. There's no doubt that many council estates of all types, not just high-rise, multi-storey, not just those with not just deck access and so on, but council estates of all types, including cottage suburbs and cottage estates, experienced problems of antisocial behaviour, increased problems of antisocial behaviour and so on. Partly exaggerated by the media, but definitely a reality. And for me, you know, the issue here is what was happening to those council estates, what was happening to those communities. And it wasn't about it, sorry if I'm repeating myself here, but it wasn't about design. The design didn't change. It was about their life situations. And also, given, as you've touched on, the residualisation, the fact that increasingly the most disadvantaged people, those with priority need, those with mental health issues or physical health issues and so on, were rightly allocated council housing. They became, and some estates certainly, and you have a kind of vicious, a vicious spiral whereby, of course, hard-to-let estates increasingly housed those people with least choice and those with most problems. So certainly some estates emerged, you know, in that era to have those kind of social issues and problems, those problems of antisocial behaviour and so on, that became portrayed as the norm. But what's happening there is politics and economics. It's not design, and in that context, I think defensible space theory is not an explanation of the problems that emerged on some estates to some extent in the 1980s and 1990s.
Thanks very much. I'm so over time. Kate, I've run out of time. But if you've got a really short comment, I'm sorry.
I've just got one brief contribution to make on this. At an architectural presentation about housing, there was amongst the people there was Ken Campbell, who had been the head of housing in the LCC Architects Department. And afterwards I asked him, how come the reputation of council housing in London has got so bad? What went wrong, in other words? And he said, the biggest mistake we made was to take the caretakers off site. He said, when you had the caretaker actually with an office on the site, and sometimes they had a flat as well, they had a pretty accurate idea of where the problem people were and how to deal with them. The response time was much quicker, and therefore the satisfaction was better. The trade union which represented the caretakers went to the LCC and said, we're being abused, we're being threatened and so on. We can't live on the estates anymore. So what they did was they put them in district offices, which meant they lost that on the intimate contact and knowledge, estate by estate, and also the response time was much slower. That was a contributing factor.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thanks for that. And apologies, Chair, back to you.
Not at all. I mean, this has been such a fascinating and rich conversation, and I hadn't wanted to restrict any of the committee members in their questioning. So what we'll do now is we'll break shortly for about 5 minutes. Apologies, it can't be longer, but I just want to make sure we can come back and wrap up before we finish at 1. So I'm really grateful for the rich conversation we've had so far from the panel, and we'll hopefully have some support to show you where the bathrooms are, or if we can grab you a coffee and tea. And we'll come back, I think, at 22 past, if that's all right. Yeah, 22, 23 past. Thank you very much. Welcome back. We are just waiting for Kate to rejoin us, but I thought we'd start with some of the questions that can be directed at the GLA representative, Charleen, just so we can sort of slightly speed through some of the more sort of... Well, we just wanted to ask really quickly around the reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, which obviously has been in the news at the moment in London, and whether there's been any assessment from the Mayor in regards to the number of social homes that have been using this material, and if that assessment's going to take place.
It's a very loaded subject at the moment, isn't it? I don't know the answer to that question, but that's something that I can definitely take away and come back to you on. I know it's a topic of discussion, particularly last week, but I can get the information for you.
Yes, please. If you could follow the committee, follow that up in writing for the committee, that would be grand. And then, Charleen, I'll continue with you now. I might come over to yourself, Alice, and anyone else who wants to contribute to this question, which is, how are current decisions over the design of social housing made, and to what extent do costs and other challenges impact design standards? So I think this is probably a lot of the questions now are going to be summarising the conversation we've been having for the last couple of hours, so feel free to draw on comments that have been made before. Charleen, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So how are some of the decisions made? So I can talk about that procedurally in terms of what happens at local and strategic level. So just get my notes. So at local level, there are, you have local policies, obviously. And I think in terms of scrutinising design, I think one of the sort of important roles in the planning department is the sort of design and conservation officers, and what they contribute in terms of influencing proposals at pre-application and PPA stage, and the value that's added, and I think it's a resource that shouldn't be undervalued, especially in terms of what Kate has been saying in terms of the financial sort of focus of developers. I think it's really great that we have that resource at local authority, and also the implementation as well of design review panels that are steadily coming forward in most local authorities. If they don't have their own, they have resources that they can use externally. So at that stage, that's where design is scrutinised. Then at strategic level, when it comes to the Mayor, we're also using our policies in terms of the local plan, and also housing, other LPGs and SPGs to help us assess applications. We're also involved in the pre-app and PPA process in terms of scrutinising design, and we're using those policies as a basis to determine whether design is acceptable or not, and also our practical experience. We also have the Mayor's design advocates as well. That's a really great resource that we have. So again, there's that sort of double layer of scrutiny at local and strategic levels. Sorry, what was it? Could you just...
I think we just look at the various factors that come into the design of social housing, and I think it's fantastic to hear, obviously, talk through the technicalities and the sort of the design guides that the GLA uses, and also on a local level. Now, I guess at some point the committee would be interested in thinking about the intersecting sort of cultural and values that, you know, have an effect on decision making when it comes to design, that obviously we've sort of laid the foreground for in the last couple of hours. So if you think any of that's applicable to the way that decisions are made in terms of social housing design in London at the moment, do feel free to draw on that.
Yeah, I think most interestingly, we have the Mayor's best practice guide in terms of including residential consultation. I think that's really an important document in terms of inclusion and the requirement for a ballot. And so I think that's where the Mayor really uses his powers in terms of planning. And I think one of a good kind of case study for that is Elm Park Estate in Sutton, where they have been consulting since 2017 and most recently have done a new ballot, their first ballot in 2022, following a series of consultation practices and events comprised of workshops, drop-in sessions, really following the Mayor's guidance post-2018, and had a really great response rate, 86% I think is, and also support for the estate regeneration, which was around 74%.
Thank you, Charleen. I'm going to actually just wrap it up there and pass over to Assemblyman Berry, who I think is going to have questions around consultation and estate regeneration, and then I'll pass over to Assemblyman Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify, not asking question number 19 on our briefing any longer.
You can if you want to.
No, I don't. I'm happy
Okay.
to. I'm happy to leave that because we did talk about
We
it
did.
somewhat before. Okay, great. So, just to Charleen again. To what extent are the communities consulted over design decisions in their areas when it comes to the sort of look and feel, the overall design, as opposed to?
The estate regenerations that I've been involved with, they've really heavily focused on consultations, practice, especially, well, not just within the estate, but within the wider surrounding. It's really important that people feel engaged, not only on the estate, but also residents surrounding the estate. Prior to the Mayor's guidance, there wasn't really I guess, guidance in terms of consultation. And Alice, you mentioned as well, depending on the financial capabilities of the developer team, whether they can afford to have really great consultation process. That's also a factor. But my experience has been that there's been really significant consultation, and that takes the form of workshops where co-designing, asking residents what are the issues, trying to really understand what the issues are, what they want. I mean, part of the whole idea of social housing is to provide for the needs of the community and the needs of the residents. So they're asking really good questions about what are the issues, what they want, what they'd like to see happen. So there's loads of workshops, there's co-design practices, there's also drop-in sessions, there's questions and answers, there's the opportunity for architects to provide options, have residents comment on those options. So there is a really good process in terms of consultation in the ones that I've been involved with, but I'm sure there are perhaps other instances where consultation is not as good, but I think the Mayor's guidance has set out a lot of expectations in terms of the estates that he's able to, that he funds. He's able to sort of control how much consultation is required in estate regeneration.
Okay, can I drill in a tiny bit, because there's obviously two kinds of guidance we're talking about. There's the guidance that is about how to conduct an estate ballot. That's whether or not you go ahead with something that will demolish. There needs to be a certain amount of information laid out. But then later, there's always a further stage of design. Often, you know, the plans are handed over to a design and build contract, then things get redesigned. In my experience, there's less involvement at that point, particularly if there has been a ballot. Often that ballot is used to give consent for whatever comes next. And sometimes I spend a lot of time working on casework. I'm finding quite a number of groups of residents coming to me and going, this isn't what we were shown before, it's completely changed. There are obviously economic constraints coming into play at this point. You're in charge of overseeing compliance with the wider estate guidance as well as the ballot rules, are you not?
That's not my responsibility. So my role is really regarding design quality.
Yes.
Not consultation. But I really take your point about schemes changing after they've been permitted. That does happen a lot, just because it's part of the process. You'll find that there's some minor amendments, sometimes they're major amendments, and sometimes those amendments aren't consulted on technically in terms of planning process. I think I can think of Clapham Park as being a good example of really keeping residents up to date, and I think it's really important that even if they are not part of the formal consultation process, that they are really kept up to date, and that takes the for Clapham Park, they have a website which basically sets out all the regeneration plans, what's happening, what changes are being made. So it's really about successful kind of communication to residents. And in terms of changes and ensuring design quality, I think that in terms of local and regional or strategic level, it's really about design officers and the planning team ensuring that any changes are of quality. Typically, at strategic level, we don't see approval of design applications. That's left with the local authorities, and it's at that point where a design officer can really scrutinise the design of windows, doors, brick detailing. It's at that level that it's really scrutinised.
Okay, thank you very much. Kate, you were indicating, and then I'll come to you, Alice, after.
What we're talking about here is the very nature of design and build. It's called value engineering, but that's conceals the fact that it's simply a cost-cutting exercise in order that they make their what they regard as their minimum profit of 20%. Back in the days when I was doing housing in London, the architect remained on board throughout the contract, and the specification and drawings which had been approved by planning were what had to be delivered because they were built into the contract. And this is a fundamental flaw with the procurement process as it now stands.
Thank you very much. Alice, you must have experience of different types of contracts. Would you like to comment on that, and particularly on the resident engagement and the wider area residents, not just residents on particular estates?
Sure, there's so much to say, so I'll just try and, I can't go into it with the time, but I'll just try and pick a few things, and I guess it links into the previous question, this issue of procurement, because decisions are often made in the current political economic climate by finances, by what's economically viable, and so at the small scale, that is where money's spent within a project. At a big scale, it's whether local authorities need to partner with a development partner, a joint venture, to develop something, and or through D&B, and in those situations, it's then led to sort of risk. So councils not being able to take the risk that others may take, and sort of more risk averse through the nature of being, financially challenged, and that comes to the sort of previous question, but it links into the sort of issues of procurement, because as soon as local authorities are doing that, it might be because that is very beneficial in some instances. It might be because that's the only financially viable option. There is a sort of loss of control of that, and I think that does impact design. But coming back more specifically to the question of consultation, I think that the sort of main point I'd like to get across, because we could go into lots of detail of different types of consultation, is that when communities are balloted, there needs to be two options on the table, which, as a minimum, which are fair options. So if you have a ballot where the ballot is demolish this estate and have new homes, or leave it as it is, that's not giving communities a fair choice, and that's often not the only two options available. You could have an existing estate where you could ballot residents to demolish it and replace with new housing, and you could have an option to retain the housing and build around it, densify it and improve, make wider estate improvements, and for the wider community too. And you could have an option to keep everything as it is. I think I think that's kind of really crucial. I think balloting is a really brilliant thing, but it has to be on options which are, you know, realistic. I have heard of situations where that's happened, where residents are sort of saying, well, of course I voted for it to be demolished because the other option is for it to stay as it is, and it's not, you know, it's falling apart. So we've had years of neglect. And so I think that's the kind of key point I'd like to get across there. And I guess the other thing that comes into that is the sort of the need for us to try and find a way to make it easier for councils to take into account the sort of social and non-financial benefits of disposing of public land or sort of demolition. I know Lord Best put in an amendment to the what's it called? What's it called? That bill. Really big bill that I can't remember the name of.
Levelling Up Regeneration Bill.
Thank you, yeah. In March, to sort of try to bring in powers for local authorities to sort of bring those sort of social and non-financial aspects to the table as justification not to dispose of public land, or I don't think it was about demolition, but I think that's more relevant to this conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. Certainly my own response to the original ballot proposals was, where is the other viable option that people ought to be able to choose from? I think that's a really good point. I think I'm handing back to you now, Chair.
Thank you very much to Assemblyman Berry, and I'll pass over to yourself, Assemblyman Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to continue questions around estate, a couple of questions on estate regeneration. I'm going to start asking Charleen about this, which is, are different factors considered alongside design during estate regeneration versus new schemes from scratch?
I mean, I can only talk from my experience in terms of just design, and my experience has really been design focused, so not much experience in terms of the factors, so I'm not sure if I can answer that question.
I wonder whether I could slightly shift that to say how, I mean, I think what I'm interested in is how the other factors might affect the design. Obviously, building a new scheme from scratch versus an estate regeneration is logistically a lot different. How does that affect the process of design?
Right. I guess one of the major factors is the existing residents and what their opinions are and what their needs are. I find that in terms of bringing forward regeneration, phasing is usually affected as well in terms of trying to cause least disruption to existing residents in terms of how many times they have to move, the conditions on site. So that is a major factor in terms of the phasing plan that comes with a planning application. Some of the other issues that I'm kind of currently facing at the moment is the retention of buildings in terms of perhaps how they may impact on housing design standards in terms of being able to produce dual aspect because of the constraints of the building, etc. Some other things that may impact.
That's fine. Don't worry. If you think of anything else, feel free to come back in. That's absolutely fine. I was wondering, and this is a very amateur observation, so I apologise hugely for those who are immense experts, but a lot of new build to me looks exactly the same. Now, I'm sure there are differences under the surfaces, 100%. But so, you know, coming off of that question about what affects the design when you're doing estate regeneration, to me, a lot of the time it all ends up looking the same anyway. And what's really interesting to me is where these particular trends in the design of new built and regenerated estates come from, and whether this is in any way a culmination of our learning over decades of social housing. I wonder if anyone's got anything to say about what You don't need to comment on that last thing, last aspect, if you don't want. But what are the trends that really that make our social housing now, and also the ones that are mixed tenure on houses that estates that have social housing? What are those trends that make them look like they do, and are those driven by good design standards? Is that a very, very loaded question?
I could start.
Please, thank you.
I guess it's sort of hard to sort of comment precisely without sort of knowing if your vision of what new housing looks like standard is the same as mine.
Well, I suppose for my new build housing is reasonably tall, which I don't have a fundamental problem with. Loads of little balconies along the edges, brick sort of facades, very, very blocky. Roads, streets that probably don't have cars along them, but aren't necessarily, wildly people friendly. That's what they look like to me.
Yeah.
And as a non-expert, I'm like, what's driven all this, and how much is, if there's really loads of feedback from residents, particularly on estate generation, how does it always end up exactly the same? What's driving these things?
My comments would be that there's a drive for higher density development, and so we think that has to mean going higher. And so as soon as you go higher, you have to build further apart. And that is also supported by separation distances in planning, which really haven't evolved that much since sort of Victorian ideals. I think sort of separation distances, maybe John and Christine, you can correct me, came about as sort of Victorian ideal about how far you had to be away from the naked body to see any detail. And so, we are still planning our cities on sort of 18-metre separation distances. And as soon as you go higher, you have to build further apart. So even if you have pedestrianised streets, they become wider, they become sort of less full of people, less activated, and as soon as you go higher, obviously you have lift cores, stair cores, etc., and you have communal stores. So sometimes at ground floor you might have sort of primary point of access and bin stores, perhaps sometimes less activated ground frontages. You also have the kind of horrid situation of having what's been termed poor doors, where developers don't want to have mixed tenures through the same core, so you have different buildings for different tenures. And I think, perhaps that plays into, sort of taller, donut blocky type housing that we see, which, it sounds like I've been quite critical of. Some of it is working. Yeah. I think the other thing is a tricky subject to deal with briefly, but is about accessibility. And so the London plan at the moment requires 10% of our homes to be M43, which is wheelchair accessible or adaptable, and 90% to be M42, which is sort of like the old lifetime home standard, which is level thresholds, etc. We definitely should be designing our city to be inclusive and accessible and flexible, because people's lives change and their circumstances change. So I support that principle. The indirect consequence of that policy, which is very, very well intentioned, is that you therefore demand that any housing that's, not a house on the street that you walk straight into that is flatted or sort of stacked maisonettes has a lift. And so you require designers and developers to go taller, because you can't justify a lift isn't financially viable on a 3 or 4 story building. So the kind of indirect consequence of that policy, which is really well intended, is that it's much, it's sort of, you arrive at a situation where to achieve that, you have taller buildings. And so what we're doing in our design is having to have really nuanced conversations with planners to say, I'm afraid that there are some homes here which have stepped access, where you come in through a front door into a hallway with a store so you can put your pram and stuff in there, but then you come straight up a stair like you would in a Warner flat, for example, or sort of historic precedents that we see around London, which makes some of the most valuable streets in our city. Mews houses, Holland Park Mews sells for insane amounts of money, but they have their sort of steps coming up, don't they? So it's kind of those policies which I think are well intended And there is flexibility in the London Plan. The London Plan does say in exceptional circumstances where you can explain why this isn't achievable. And so we have those conversations about the type of streets that we want to create, the type of that sort of public space we want to create, which is where we have front doors onto streets, to try to sort of, justify that as well. So I think I went into a bit too much detail probably, but there are reasons why sort of separation distances, sort of tenures, mixed tenures, developers sort of wanting to separate those off, spaces between and accessibility by accident, meaning that flatted buildings are the way forward.
Thank you for indulging me. That's absolutely fascinating. Didn't hear a huge amount about design in there, which you probably. But no, that's not a criticism. No. I think that's I asked the question about why they are, and actually it sounds like there's a lot of.
I mean that the accessibility thing leads straight into design, which is sort of typology is where you have stacked maisonettes and you're achieving front doors onto streets and you're building 20% less area because you haven't got the corridors and the space. You're pushing all that into the street, so it's inherently led into design. I mean, obviously, like sort of what you clad a building in is different, but
thank you. Did anyone else want to come in?
Okay. If I could come in just with a footnote to that. Back in the late 70s, people might have thought it was a virtue that social housing didn't stand out from its surroundings. The complaint was, that it didn't integrate. But I wonder whether you've heard of Goldsmith Street in Norwich by Michael Riches, which is notable in that it's the local authority land, the local authority financed it, and it's zero carbon development. It's quite an achievement, and of course it got numerous awards. And Michael Riches were the firm that went on to renovate the last phase of Park Hill in Sheffield. So architecturally, you couldn't say that it sort of has a lot of wow factor, but it's very, very acceptable and polite, and people are absolutely delighted to live there. But once again, of course, the people who moved in said, well, this is wonderful. In 5 years, I can apply for right to buy. So then Norwich City must be thinking, well, what the hell did we pull out all the stops for and exert ourselves to the nth degree in order to turn all this over to the private sector?
Thanks, Kate.
That's
absolutely.
the big conundrum.
Charleen,
if I could just say that, once again, on the subject of right to buy, in Scotland, where, as you know, they scrubbed right to buy years ago, an accusation has been levelled that this has held back investment in social housing. Not a bit of it. In England, the rate of social housing provision is 9.7 per 10,000 people. In Scotland, it's 13.9. That's almost 50% more than in England.
Thanks, Kate. Charleen.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, when you talk about design, are you referring to the aesthetics, the external appearance of the building specifically?
No.
Okay.
I think we've covered on a whole huge ranges of aspects of design in this session. But if you're outside looking at an estate, then obviously certain things catch your eye, and they're always driven by something else. So that was my. I don't generally care what's actually on the outside. I think I'm going to pass back to you, Chair.
I think we are rapidly approaching the end of the meeting. I have found this conversation fascinating, and I'm really grateful for the expertise and the variation in that. I am going to offer a maximum closing minute comments, just because I know that sometimes people come here prepared with certain things that they do want to express that they don't necessarily get to do so given our very specific questioning. So I'll start with yourself, Christine. No compulsion to, but if there was just sort of a minute of closing remarks, please feel free to make them.
Well, I think it's just worth remarking, one thing that hasn't really been covered is that an organisation like Peabody has got a number of heritage buildings. Some of our buildings are Grade 2 listed, some are locally listed, some are in conservation areas, so they present particular challenges when it comes to regeneration, things like zero carbon standards and so on. But it is something we're very conscious of, and we're doing all we can to keep the estates with their original appearance, but bring them up to date insofar as you can, with double glazing and other things that might sort of be in conflict with the regulations that apply when you have a listed building.
Thank you, Christina. I know that you were able to give us some live examples of that when we did the site visit last week, so thank you for that. Charleen.
Thank you. I guess I just wanted to clarify that it may have seemed perhaps that in terms of design and post-war estates, that in terms of failures, I think I commented on that. I just wanted to say that there are really great examples of post-war estates, I think both in Lambeth and Camden. So I definitely agree with John, and also the fact that design alone, design can affect how people live and contribute to the well-being, etc. And it's not the only factor, I guess, to consider in the failure of post-war estates. If, well, failure is not maybe a word John would use, but yeah, just to say that there are really great examples of it.
Thank you, Charleen. And what I'd say is please feel free to follow anything up after the meeting to the committee in writing, because we'll be obviously producing an output from this investigation, and we'd love to continue hearing your thoughts on that. John, over to you.
Well, my thanks to my fellow panel members, because I've learnt a lot, and that's been really interesting to hear from planners and architects, and obviously Christine from a historical point of view. I'll admit to being slightly kind of concerned coming into this meeting in view of some of the briefing paper that I saw and the way it was framed online. But actually, I think it's been a really good, wide-ranging discussion. I think probably, speaking for myself and maybe for others, I feel that we've probably made the points that we want to, so I won't kind of labour those points further, because I think I've probably talked too much anyway. I guess I was briefly a local councillor, so I'm very aware of the constraints that local government operates under, and I'm very aware that social housing, what we can do, what we aspire to do is very controlled essentially by central government. So more power to it, elbow in building good quality social housing, as much of it as you can in the meantime, and I hope that in the future, I'm not making a party political point here, but I'm hoping in the future that central government will be more sympathetic and more supportive of social rent housing, because it's a vital component of any viable housing market.
Thank you, John. And yourself, Kate.
Thank you. I also much enjoyed this session, found it very stimulating. I'd just like to mention one exercise that was carried out by Architects for Social Housing for the San Rafael estate in Brent, which they called Alternative to Demolition, which was trying to avoid site clearance by densification and also by refurbishing the existing 741 council-owned houses. And through the densification, they were adding 608 new homes through infill and extension without the need for any evictions or demolitions. So this, for me, ticks all the boxes as being much less socially disruptive, much more in tune with the need for conserving energy and not sending masses of stuff to infill. And they produced an enormous glossy report, which was far too heavy for me to carry, but I think I might post it to you, if I may.
We would really welcome that. Thank you, Kate. And then just final brief comments from yourself, Alice.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise, echo comments. I've really enjoyed the session, and I've learnt a lot, so thank you. Kate's just made my point for me, which is about sort of the need to really think about whether demolition is the right thing to do. We've worked on projects similarly, albeit at a slight scale. I thought at a large scale, but until you brought that out, it's not quite large scale. But sort of 250 home estates where, without demolishing anything, we're putting the same number of homes back, and sorting out any sort of wider sort of improvements as well. And not only is that sort of protecting social infrastructure and densifying our cities, but it's also as Kate mentioned, thinking about embodied carbon. We know that even if you build a passive house home, if you knock building down to build a passive house home, it takes decades in use to recoup the carbon you've lost. And then the second thing with that is that we do need to retrofit our existing housing stock, and there's a very interesting study that the Welsh Government have done, not a study, practically done it, the Welsh Government with Cardiff University, to upgrade all of their existing council housing in Wales to an EPC C, and they're now working on upgrading that to EPC A. So that's a really interesting precedent for us all.
Thank you very much, and like I said, we will definitely stay in touch with the guests in regards to our upcoming launch of a report that deals with exactly the issues that yourself and Kate have concluded on. So a huge thank you to the guests. We've had honestly such a fantastic and enlightening conversation. I'd ask you to stay seated for just a moment whilst we wrap up the end of our business, but my real sincere thanks once again for the expertise that you've brought to the committee today. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Agreed. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 23-24 Assembly year? Can I also ask the committee to note the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the site visit to the Blackfriars Estate and St John Hills Estate last week? The next meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee will take place on the 18th of October 2023 at 2 p.m. in this chamber, City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. It's been great to have you all joining us. Thank you.